7. Christmas Day, Elko County, Nevada. Sandy Sarver woke soon after dawn came to the high plains. The early sun glimmered vaguely at the bedroom windows of the house trailer. The world was so still that it seemed time must have stopped. She could turn over and go back to sleep if she so desired, but she had 8 more days of vacation ahead of her. Ernie and Faye Block had closed the Tranquility Motel and had gone to visit their grandchildren in Milwaukee. The adjacent Tranquility Grill, which Sandy operated with her husband, Ned, was also closed over the holidays. But Sandy knew she could not get back to sleep, for she was wide awake and horny. She stretched like a cat beneath the blankets. She wanted to wake Ned, smother him with kisses, and pull him atop her. Ned was merely a shadowy form in the dark bedroom, breathing deeply, sound asleep. Although she wanted him badly, she did not wake him. There would be plenty of time for lovemaking later in the day. She slipped quietly out of bed into the bathroom and showered. She made the end of it a cold shower. For years she had been uninterested in sex, frigid. Not long ago, the sight of her own nude body had embarrassed her and filled her with shame. Although she did not know the reason for the new feelings that had risen in her lately, she definitely had changed. It had started the summer before last, when sex had suddenly seemed, well, appealing. That sounded silly now. Of course sex was appealing. But prior to that summer, lovemaking had always been a chore to be endured. Her late erotic blossoming was a delightful surprise and an inexplicable mystery. Nude, she returned to the shadowy bedroom. She took a sweater and a pair of jeans from the closet and dressed. In the small kitchen, she started to pour orange juice, but stopped when stricken by the urge to go for a drive. She left a note for Ned, put on a sheepskin-lined jacket, and went outside to the Ford pickup. Sex and driving were the 2 new passions in her life, and the latter was almost as important to her as the former. That was another funny thing. Until the summer before last, she hated going anywhere in the pickup except to work and back, and she seldom drove. She not only disliked highway travel, but had dreaded it, the way some people were afraid of airplanes. But now, other than sex, there was nothing she liked better than to get behind the wheel of the truck and take off, journeying on a whim without a destination, speeding. She had always understood why sex repelled her. That had been no mystery. She could blame her father, Horton Purney, for her frigidity. Though she had never known her mother, who had died giving birth, Sandy had known her father far too well. They had lived in a ramshackle house on the outskirts of Barstow, on the edge of the lonely California desert, just the 2 of them, and Sandy's earliest memories were of sexual abuse. Horton Purney had been a moody, brooding, mean, and dangerous man. Until Sandy escaped from home at 14, her father had used her as if she had been an erotic toy. Only recently had she realized that her strong dislike for highway travel was also related to something else that her father had done to her. Horton Purney had run a motorcycle repair shop out of a sagging, sun-scorched, unpainted barn on the same property as his house, but he had never made much money from it. Therefore, twice a year, he put Sandy in the car and made the 2.5-hour drive across the desert to Las Vegas, where he knew an enterprising pimp, Samson Cherrick. Cherrick had a list of perverts with a special interest in children, and he was always happy to see Sandy. After a few weeks in Vegas, Sandy's father packed, put Sandy in the car, and drove back to Barstow, his pockets bulging with cash. For Sandy, the long drive to Vegas was a nightmare journey, for she knew what awaited her at their destination. The trip back to Barstow was worse, for it was not an escape from Vegas, but a return to the grim life in that ramshackle house and the dark, urgent, insatiable lust of Horton Purney. In either direction, the road had led to hell, and she had learned to loathe the rumble of the car's engine, the hum of tires on the pavement, and the unspooling highway ahead. Therefore, the pleasure she now took from driving and sex seemed miraculous. She could not understand where she'd found the strength and will to overcome her horrible past. Since the summer before last, she simply changed, was still changing, And oh, it was glorious to feel the chains of self-loathing and the bonds of fear breaking apart, to feel self-respect for the first time in her life, to feel free. Now she got into the Ford pickup and started the engine. Their house trailer was set on an unlandscaped half-acre lot at the southern edge of the tiny, almost non-existent town of Biawau, along Route 21, a 2-lane blacktop. As Sandy drove away from the trailer, there seemed to be nothing but empty plains, rolling hills, scattered butts, mesas, rocky outcroppings, grass, brush, and waterless arroyos for 1,000 miles in every direction. The intensely blue morning sky was immense, and as she got the Ford up to speed, Sandy felt as if she might take flight. If she headed north on 21, she would pass through Biawau and soon come to Interstate 80, which led east toward Elko or west toward Battle Mountain. Instead, she went south into a beautifully barren landscape. With skill and ease, she guided the 4-wheel drive pickup over the badly weathered county road at 70 miles an hour. In 15 minutes, Route 21 petered out into a gravel roadbed that led south through another 83 miles of uninhabited and desolate territory. She did not follow it, choosing instead to turn east on a 1-lane dirt track flanked by wild grass and scrub. Some snow lay on the ground this Christmas morning, though not much. In the distance, the mountains were white, but down here, the annual precipitation was less than 15 inches a year, little of it in the form of snow. Here was an inch-deep skin of snow, there a small hillock against which a shallow drift had formed, and here a sparkling bush on which wind-driven snow had hardened into a lacy garment of ice. But by far the largest portion of the land was bare and dry and brown. Sandy drove fast on the dirt, too, and behind her a cloud of dust plumed up. In time she left the track, headed overland, north and west, coming at last to a familiar place, though she had not set out with this destination in mind. For reasons she did not understand, her subconscious often guided her to this spot during her solitary drives, seldom in a direct line, but by wandering routes, so her arrival was usually a surprise to her. She stopped, set the brake. With the engine idling, she stared for a while through the dusty windshield. She came here because it made her feel better, though she did not know why. The slopes, the spines and teeth of rock, the grass and brush, formed a pleasing picture, though the scene was no prettier and no different from thousands of other places nearby. Yet here she felt a sublime peacefulness that could not be attained anywhere else. She switched off the engine and got out of the pickup, and for a while she strolled back and forth, hands jammed into the pockets of her sheepskin-lined jacket, oblivious of the stingingly cold air. Her drive through the wildlands had brought her back toward civilization, and Interstate 80 lay only a couple of 100 yards to the north. The occasional roar of a passing truck echoed like a distant dragon's growl, but the holiday traffic was light. Beyond the highway, on the uplands to the northwest, lay the Tranquility Motel and Grill. But Sandy glanced just once in that direction. She was more interested in the immediate terrain, which exerted a mysterious and powerful attraction for her, and which seemed to radiate peace the way a rock in evening radiated the heat of the sun that it had absorbed during the day. She wasn't trying to analyze her affinity for this patch of ground. Evidently, there was some subtle harmony in the contours of the land, an interplay of line, form, and shadow that defied definition. Any attempt to decode its attraction would be as foolish as trying to analyze the beauty of a sunset or the appeal of a favorite flower. That Christmas morning, Sandy did not yet know that Ernie Block had been drawn, as if possessed, to the same patch of ground on December 10th, when he had been on his way home from the freight office in Elko. She did not know that it aroused in Ernie an electrifying sense of pending epiphany, and more than a little fear. emotions quite unlike those that it stirred in her. Weeks would pass before she learned that her special retreat had a strong attraction for others beside herself, both friends and strangers. Chicago, Illinois. For Father Stefan Wykazik, that stocky Polish dynamo, rector of St. Bernadette's, rescuer of troubled priests, it was the busiest Christmas morning he had ever known, and as the day wore on, it swiftly became the most meaningful Christmas of his life. He celebrated the second Mass at St. Bernadette's, spent an hour greeting parishioners who stopped by the rectory with fruit baskets and boxes of homemade cookies and other gifts, then drove to University Hospital to pay a visit to Winton Tolk, the policeman who had been shot in an uptown sandwich shop yesterday afternoon. Following emergency surgery, Tolk had been in the intensive care unit yesterday afternoon and all through the night. Christmas morning, he had been moved to a semi-private room adjacent to the ICU, for although he was no longer in critical condition, he still needed to be monitored constantly. When Father Wykazik arrived, Raynella Tolk, Winton's wife, was at her husband's bedside. She was quite attractive, with chocolate-brown skin and stylish, close-cropped hair. Mrs. Tolk, I'm Stefan Wykazik, but, he smiled, relax. I'm not here to give anyone the last rites. Good, Winton said, because I'm sure not planning on dying. The wounded policeman was not only fully conscious, but alert and apparently suffering no pain. His bed was raised to a sitting position. Although his broad chest was heavily bandaged, and although a cardiac telemetry device hung around his neck, and in spite of the IV line that was dripping glucose and antibiotics into the median basilic vein in his left arm, he looked remarkably well considering his recent misadventure. Father Wykazik stood at the foot of the bed, his tension betrayed only by the way he kept turning his black fedora around and around in his strong hands. When he realized what he was doing, he quickly put the hat on a chair. He said, Mr. Tolk, if you feel up to it, I've come to ask you a few questions about what happened yesterday. Both Tolk and his wife looked puzzled by Stefan's curiosity. The priest gave a partial explanation for his interest, though only partial. The fellow who cruised the uptown district with you for the past week, Brendan Cronin, was in my employ, he said, maintaining Brendan's cover as a lay worker for the church. Oh, I'd like to meet him, Raynella said, her face brightening. He saved my life, Tolk said. He did a crazy brave thing, which he shouldn't have done in a million years, but I'm sure glad he did it. Raynella said, Mr. Cronin walked into that sandwich shop not knowing if all the gunmen were dead, not knowing if he might be shot. It's strictly against police procedure to walk into a situation like that, Winton said. I'd have handled it by the book myself if I'd been one of those outside. I can't exactly applaud what Brendan did, Father, but I owe him my life for doing it. Amazing, Father Wykazik said, as if this were the first time he had heard of Brendan's bravery. In fact, yesterday he had spoken at length with Winton Tolk's precinct captain and old friend, and had heard Brendan praised for courage and damned for foolishness. I've always known Brendan's a dependable fellow. Did he also provide first aid? He might have, Winton said. Don't really know. I remember regaining consciousness, and there he was, sort of looming over me, calling my name, but I was still in a haze, you see. It's a miracle Wynne survived, Raynella said in a tremulous voice. Now, honey, Winton said softly. I did make it, and that's all that counts. When he was sure his wife would be all right, he looked at Stefan and said, Everyone's amazed that I could lose so much blood and pull through. From what I hear, I must have lost buckets. Did Brendan apply a tourniquet? Tolk frowned. Don't know. Like I said, I was in a daze. Father Wachsett hesitated, wondering how to find out what he needed to know without revealing the extraordinary possibility that motivated this visit. I know you're not very clear about what happened, but did you notice anything peculiar about Brendan's hands? Peculiar? What do you mean? He touched you, didn't he? Sure, I guess he felt for a pulse, then checked around to see where the bleeding was coming from. Well, did you feel anything unusual when he touched you? Anything odd? Stefan asked carefully, frustrated by the need to be vague. I don't seem to be following your line of thought, Father. Stefan Wachsett shook his head. Never mind. The important thing is that you're well. He glanced at his watch and, feigning surprise, said, Good heavens, I'm late for an appointment. Before they could respond, he snatched his hat from the chair, wished them Godspeed, and hurried out, no doubt leaving them astonished by his behavior. When people saw Father Wachsett walking toward them, they were usually reminded of drill sergeants or football coaches. His solid body and the self-confident, aggressive way he used it were not what one expected of a priest. And when he was in a hurry, he was not so much like a drill sergeant or a football coach as he was like a tank. From Tolk's room, Father Wachsett blitzed down the hall, shoved through a pair of heavy swinging doors, then through another pair into the intensive care unit where the wounded policeman had been until just an hour ago. He asked to speak to the physician on duty, Dr. Royce Albright. With the hope that God would forgive a few little white lies told in a good cause, Stefan identified himself as the Tolk family's priest and implied that Mrs. Tolk had sent him to get the full story of her husband's condition, about which she was not yet entirely clear. Dr. Albright looked like Jerry Lewis and had a deep rumbling voice like Henry Kissinger, which was disconcerting, but he was willing to answer whatever questions Father Wachsett wished to pose. He was not Winton Tolk's personal physician, but he was interested in the case. You can assure Mrs. Tolk that there's almost no danger of a setback. He's coming along marvelously. Shot twice in the chest, point blank, with 38. Until yesterday, no one here would have believed that anyone could take 2 shots in the chest from a large caliber handgun and be out of intensive care in 24 hours. Mr. Tolk is incredibly lucky. The bullets missed the heart then and all vital organs? Not only that, Albright said, but neither round did major damage to any veins or arteries. A .38 caliber slug has lots of punch, Father. Ordinarily, it chews up the victim. In Tolk's case, one major artery and vein were nicked, but neither was severed. Very fortunate indeed. Then I suppose the bullet was stopped by bone at some point? Deflected, yes, but not stopped. Both slugs were found in soft tissue, and that's another amazing thing. No shattered bones, not even a small fracture. A very lucky man. Father Wachsett nodded. When the 2 slugs were removed from his body, was there any indication they were underweight for .38 caliber ammunition? I mean, maybe the cartridges were faulty with too little lead in the bullets. That would explain why, even though it was a .38 revolver, the shots did less damage than a pair of .22s. Albright frowned. Don't know. Could be. You'd have to ask the police or Dr. Sonneford, the surgeon who took the slugs out of Tolk. I understand Officer Tolk lost a great deal of blood. Grimacing, Albright said, must be a mistake about that on his chart. I haven't had a chance to talk to Dr. Sonneford today, it being Christmas. But according to the chart, Tolk received over 4 liters of whole blood in the operating room. Of course, that can't be correct. Why not? Father, if Tolk actually lost 4 liters of blood before they got him to the hospital, there wouldn't be enough in him to maintain even minimal circulation. He'd have been dead, stone cold dead. Las Vegas, Nevada. Mary and Pete Monatella, George's parents, arrived at her apartment at 6 on Christmas morning, bleary-eyed and grumpy from too little sleep, but determined to take up the rightful posts by the brightly trimmed tree before Marcy awoke. Mary, as tall as Georgia, had once been almost as shapely as her daughter, too. Now she was heavy, girdled. Pete was shorter than his wife, barrel-chested, a bantam rooster who seemed to strut when he walked, but was one of the most self-effacing men Georgia had ever known. They came burdened with presents for their only grandchild. They had a present for Georgia, plus the usual gifts they brought every time they visited. Well-meant but annoying criticism, unwanted advice, guilt. Mary was hardly through the door before she announced that Georgia should clean the ventilation hood above the range, and she rummaged under the sink until she found a spray bottle of Windex and a rag with which she performed the chore herself. She also observed that the tree looked underdecorated. "It needs more lights, Georgia." And when she saw how Marcy's presents were wrapped, she professed despair. "My God, Georgia, the wrapping papers aren't bright enough. The ribbons aren't big enough. Little girls like bright papers with Santa Claus on them and lots of ribbons." For his part, her father was content to focus all his discontent upon the huge tray of cookies on the kitchen counter. "These are all store-bought, Georgia. Didn't you make any homemade cookies this year?" "Well, Dad, I've been working a little overtime lately, and then there's the classes I'm taking at UNLV, and..." "I know it's hard being a single mother, baby," he said, "but we're talking fundamentals here. Homemade cookies are one of the best parts of Christmas. It's an absolute fundamental." "Fundamental," Georgia's mother agreed. The Christmas spirit had been late in coming to Georgia this year, and even now she had a tenuous grip on it. Subject to her parents' well-intentioned but infuriating non-stop commentary on her shortcomings, she might have lost the holiday mood altogether if Marcy had not put in a timely appearance at 6:30, just after Georgia had slipped a 14-pound turkey into the oven for the big meal later in the day. The girl shuffled into the living room in her pajamas, as cute as any idealized child in a Norman Rockwell painting. "Did Santa bring my little Miss Doctor kit?" "Pete said he brought you more than that, Pumpkin. Look here, just look at all Santa brought." Marcy turned and saw the tree which Santa had put up during the night and the mountain of gifts. She gasped, "Wow." The child's excitement was transmitted to Georgia's parents, and for the time being they forgot about such things as dusty ventilation hoods and store-bought cookies. For a while, the apartment was filled with joyous, busy sounds. But by the time Marcy had opened half her gifts, the celebratory mood began to change, and in crept a little of the darkness that would reappear in a far more frightening form later in the day. In a whiny voice that was out of character, the girl grumped that Santa had not remembered the Little Miss Doctor kit. She discarded a much-wanted doll without even taking it out of its box, moving to the next package in the hope that it contained Little Miss Doctor, clawing at the wrappings. Something in the child's demeanor, a queerness in her eyes, disquieted Georgia. Soon, Mary and Pete noticed it as well. They began urging Marcy to take more time with each present, to get more pleasure out of each before rushing on to the next, but their entreaties were not successful. Georgia had not put the Dr. Play kit under the tree. It was hidden in a closet as a final surprise, but with only 3 boxes left, Marcy was pale and trembling in anticipation of Little Miss Doctor. In God's name, what was so important about it? Many of the toys already unwrapped were more expensive and more interesting than the Play Doctor's bag. Why was her attention so intently and unnaturally focused on that single item? Why was she so obsessed with it? When the last of the gifts beneath the tree and the last of those from Mary and Pete were open, Marcy let out a sob of purest misery. Santa didn't bring it. He forgot. Considering all the wondrous presents strewn across the room, the girl's despondency was shocking. Georgia was disconcerted and displeased by Marcy's rudeness, and she saw that her own parents were startled, dismayed, and impatient with this unexpected and unjustified tantrum. Suddenly afraid that Christmas was collapsing into ruins around her, Georgia ran to the bedroom closet, plucked the crucial gift from behind the shoeboxes, and returned to the living room with it. With frenzied desperation, Marcy snatched the box from her mother. "What's gotten into the child?" Mary asked. "Yeah," Pete said. "What's so important about this little doctor?" Marcy tore frantically at the wrappings until she saw that the package contained the item she most desired. Immediately she grew calm, stopped trembling. "Little Miss Doctor, Santa didn't forget." "Honey, maybe it's not from Santa," Georgia said. She was relieved to see the child she loved emerging from that strange and unpleasant mood. "Not all your gifts came from Santa. Better look at the tag." Marcy dutifully searched for the tag, read the few words on it, and looked up with an uncertain smile. "It's from Daddy." Georgia felt her parents staring at her, but she did not meet their eyes. They knew that Alan had gone off to Acapulco with his latest bimbo, the air-haired blonde named Pepper, and that he had not bothered to leave so much as a card for Marcy, and they no doubt disapproved of Georgia letting him off the hook like this. Later, when Georgia was in the kitchen squatting in front of the oven checking on the turkey, her mother stooped down beside her and said softly, "Why'd you do it, Georgia? Why'd you put that louse's name on the gift she wanted most of all?" Georgia slid the rack partway out of the oven, bringing the turkey into the light. With a ladle, she scooped the drippings from the pan and basted the roasting bird. Finally, she said, "Marcy shouldn't have her Christmas ruined just because her father's a jackass." "You shouldn't protect her from the truth," Mary said quietly. "The truth's too ugly for a 7-year-old. The sooner she knows what a louse her father is, the better. You know what your dad heard about this woman Alan's living with? I sure hope this bird's going to be done by noon." Mary would not drop the subject. "She's on the call list of 2 casinos, Georgia. That's what Pete heard. You know what I mean? She's a call girl. Alan's living with a call girl. What's wrong with him?" Georgia closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Mary said, "Well, if he wants nothing to do with Marcy, that's fine. God knows what diseases he's picked up living with that woman." Georgia pushed the turkey back into the oven, closed the door, and stood up. "Could we not talk about this anymore? I thought you'd want to know what the woman is. So now I know." Their voices dropped lower, became more intense. "What if he comes around someday and says, 'Pepper and I want Marcy to go to Acapulco with us, or Disneyland, or maybe just stay at their place for a while?'" Exasperated, Georgia said, "Mother, he doesn't want anything to do with Marcy because she reminds him of his responsibilities." "But what if—" "Mother, damn it!" Although Georgia had not raised her voice, there was such anger in those 3 words that the effect on her mother was immediate. A hurt look crossed Mary's face. Stung, she turned away from Georgia. She went quickly to the refrigerator, opened it, and looked over the contents of the overloaded shelves. "Oh, you made gnocchi." "Not store-bought," Georgia said shakily, "homemade." She meant to be conciliatory, but she realized that her comment might be misconstrued as a snide reference to her father's dismay over store-bought cookies. She bit her lip and fought back scalding tears. Still looking into the refrigerator, a tremor still in her voice, Mary said, "You're going to have potatoes too? And what's this? Oh, you've already grated the cabbage for coleslaw. I thought you'd need help, but I guess you've thought of everything." She closed the refrigerator door and looked for something she could do to occupy her and get them through this awkward moment. Tears were visible in her eyes. Georgia virtually flung herself away from the counter and threw her arms around her mother. Mary returned the hug, and for a while they clung to each other, finding speech both unnecessary and impossible. Holding fast, Mary said, "I don't know why I'm like this. My mother was the same with me. I swore I'd never be like this with you. I love you just the way you are." Maybe it's because you're my only. If I'd been able to have a couple of others, I wouldn't be so tough on you. It's partly my fault, Mom. I've been so touchy lately. And why shouldn't you be? Her mother said, holding her tight. That louse walks out on you. You're supporting yourself and Marcy, going to school. You've got every right to be touchy. We're so proud of you, Georgia. It takes such courage to do what you're doing. In the living room, Marcy began shrieking. What now? Georgia wondered. When she got to the living room archway, she saw her father trying to persuade Marcy to play with the doll. Look here, Pete said. Dolly cries when you tilt her this way, giggles when you tilt her that way. I don't want to play with the dumb doll, Marcy pouted. She was holding the make-believe plastic and rubber hypodermic syringe from the Little Miss Doctor kit, and that unsettling intensity and urgency had taken possession of her again. I want to give you another shot. But honey, Pete said, you've already given me 20 shots. I've got to practice, Marcy said. I'll never grow up to be my own doctor if I don't start practicing now. Pete looked at Georgia with exasperation. Mary said, what is it with this Little Miss Doctor thing? I wish I knew, Georgia said. Marcy grimaced as she pushed the plunger of the fake hypodermic. Perspiration glistened on her brow. I wish I knew, Georgia repeated uneasily. Boston, Massachusetts. It was the worst Christmas of Ginger Weiss's life. Although Jewish, her beloved father had always celebrated Christmas in a secular spirit because he liked the harmony and goodwill that the holiday promoted, and after his death, Ginger had continued to regard December 25th as a special day, a time of joy. Until today, Christmas had never depressed her. George and Rita did all they could to make Ginger feel a part of their celebration, but she was acutely aware that she was an outsider. The Hannaby's 3 sons had brought their families to Baywatch for several days, and the huge house was filled with the silvery laughter of children. Everyone made an effort to include Ginger in all the Hannaby traditions, from popcorn stringing to neighborhood caroling. Christmas morning, she was there to watch the children attack the mountain of gifts, and following the example of the other adults, she crawled around on the floor with the kids, helping them assemble and play with their new toys. For a couple of hours, her despair abated, and she was assimilated by the Hannaby family in spite of herself. However, at lunch, rich with holiday delicacies, yet essentially a light meal, just a hint of the extravagant dinner feast to come that evening, Ginger felt out of place again. Much conversation involved reminiscences of previous holidays of which she'd not been a part. After lunch, she pleaded a headache and escaped to her room. The splendid view of the bay calmed her, but couldn't arrest her spiral into depression. She desperately hoped Pablo Jackson would call tomorrow and say that he had studied the problem of memory blocks and was ready to hypnotize her again. Ginger's visit to Pablo had distressed George and Rita less than she had expected. They were upset that she had gone out alone, risking an amnesic seizure with no friend to help her, and they made her promise she would allow either Rita or one of the servants to drive her to and from Pablo's apartment in the future, but they did not attempt to argue against the unconventional treatment she had sought from the magician. The Bayview's capacity to calm Ginger was limited. She turned from the window, got up, and went to the bed, where she was surprised to find 2 books in the nightstand. One was a fantasy by Tim Powers, an author she had read before. The other a copy of something called Twilight in Babylon, and she had no idea where they had come from. There were 6 other books in the room, borrowed from the library downstairs, for during the past few weeks she had little to do but read. But this was the first time she'd seen Powers' book and Twilight in Babylon. The former, a tale of time-traveling trolls fighting their own secret war against British goblins during the American Revolution, looked delightful, the type of exotic story that her father had enjoyed. A slip of paper laid loosely in the front identified it as a review copy. Rita had a friend who was a reviewer for the Globe and who sometimes passed along intriguing books before they were available in the stores. Evidently, these had come within the last day or two, and Rita, aware of Ginger's tastes in fiction, had put them in her room. She set the Powers book aside for later delectation, and she took a closer look at Twilight in Babylon. She'd never heard of the author, Dominic Corvasis, but the brief summary of the story was intriguing, and when she had read the first page, she was hooked. However, before continuing, she moved from the bed to one of the comfortable chairs, and only then glanced at the author's photograph on the back of the jacket. Her breath caught in her throat. Fear filled her. For a moment, she thought the photograph was going to be the kicker that knocked her into another fugue. She tried to fling the book aside, but could not. Tried to stand up, but could not. She drew deep breaths, closed her eyes, and waited for her pulse rate to sink toward normal. When she opened her eyes and looked at the author's photograph again, it still disturbed her, though not as badly as it had at first. She knew that she had seen this man before, had met him somewhere, and not in the best of circumstances, though she could not remember where or when. His brief biography on the jacket flap informed her that he had lived in Portland, Oregon, and now resided in Laguna Beach, California. As she had never been in either of those places, she could not imagine when their paths might have crossed. Dominic Corvasis, about 35, was a striking man who reminded Ginger of Anthony Perkins when that actor had been younger. His looks were compelling enough that she could not imagine having forgotten where she had met him. Her instant reaction to the photo was strange, and some might have dismissed it as a meaningless fillip of an overwrought mind. But during the past 2 months, she had learned to respect strange developments and to look for meaning in them, no matter how meaningless they seemed. She stared at Corvasis' photo, hoping to nudge her memory. Finally, with an almost clairvoyant sense that Twilight in Babylon would somehow change her life, she opened it and began to read. Chicago, Illinois. From University Hospital, Father Stefan Wykazik drove across town to the laboratory operated by the Scientific Investigation Division of the Chicago Police Department. Though it was Christmas Day, municipal workers were still cleaning last night's snowfall from the streets. Only a couple of men were on duty at the police lab, which was located in an aging government building, and the old rooms had the deserted feeling of an elaborate Egyptian tomb buried far beneath desert sands. Footsteps echoed resoundingly back and forth between the tile floors and the high ceilings. Ordinarily, the lab did not share its information with anyone from outside the police and judicial systems. But half the police officers in Chicago were Catholics, which meant that Father Wykazik had more than a few friends on the force. Stefan had importuned some of those friends to make petitions in his name and to pave the way for him at the SID. He was greeted by Dr. Murphy Ames, a paunchy man with a perfectly bald head and walrus mustache. They'd spoken on the telephone earlier, before Stefan left the rectory for University Hospital, and now Murphy Ames was ready for him. They settled on 2 stools at a laboratory bench. A tall, opaque window loomed in front of them, decorated with dark streaks of pigeon dung. On the marble top of the bench, Ames had laid out a file folder and several other items. I must say, Father, I'd never compromise case information like this if there were any possibility of a trial arising from the shootout at that sandwich shop. But I suppose as both perpetrators are dead, there's no one to be put on trial. I appreciate that, Dr. Ames, I really do, and I'm grateful for the time and energy you've expended on my behalf. Curiosity ruled Murphy Ames's face. He said, I don't really understand the reason for your interest in the case. I'm not entirely sure of it myself, Stefan said cryptically. He had not revealed his purpose to the higher authorities who had made him welcome at the lab, and he did not intend to enlighten Ames either. For one thing, if he told them what was on his mind, they would think he was dotty and would be less inclined to cooperate with him. Well, Ames said, miffed at not being taken into Stefan's confidence. You asked about the bullets. He opened a manila envelope of the type that ties shut with a string, and he emptied its contents into his palm. 2 gray lumps of lead. The surgeon removed these from Winton Toke. You said you were particularly interested in them. I certainly am, Stefan said, taking them in his own hand when Ames offered them. You've weighed these, I suppose? I understand that's standard procedure. And they weigh what 38 slugs should? If you mean did they fragment on impact, they did not. They're so misshapen, they must have impacted bones, so it's surprising they didn't fragment a little or a lot, but in fact, they're both intact. Actually, Father Wyckowick said, staring at the slugs in his hand, I meant, were they underweight for 38s? Malformed ammunition, factory mistakes, or were they the right size? Oh, the right size, no doubt of that. Big enough to do plenty of damage, terrible damage, Father Wyckowick said thoughtfully. The gun? From a larger envelope, Ames produced the revolver with which Winton Toke was shot. A snub-nosed Smith & Wesson .38 Chief Special. You've examined it, test-fired it? Yes, standard procedure. No indication that anything's wrong with it? Specifically, is the bore poorly machined, or is there some other anomaly that would result in the bullet leaving the muzzle at a much slower velocity than it should? That's a peculiar question, Father. The answer is no. It's a fine Chief Special, up to the usual high standards of Smith & Wesson. Putting the 2 expended bullets back into the small envelope from which he had seen Ames take them, Father Wyckowick said, What about the cartridges these bullets came from? Is there any chance they were filled with too little powder, that they carried an inadequate charge? The SID man blinked. I gather one thing you're trying to find out is why 2 .38s in the chest didn't do more damage. Stefan Wyckowick nodded but offered no elaboration. Were there any unexpended cartridges in the revolver? A couple, plus spare ammunition in one of the gunman's jacket pockets, another dozen. Did you cut open any of the unexpended shells to see if maybe they carried an inadequate charge? No reason to, Murphy Ames said. Would it be possible for you to check one of them now? Possible, but why? Father, what in the world is this all about? Stefan sighed. I know this is an imposition, Dr. Ames, and it behooves me to repay your kindness with an explanation, but I can't, not yet. Priests, like physicians and attorneys, must sometimes respect confidences, keep secrets. But if I'm ever at liberty to reveal what lies behind my curiosity, you'll be the first to know. Ames stared, and Stefan met his eyes forthrightly. Finally, the SID man opened another envelope. This contained the unexpended cartridges from the dead gunman's .38 Chief Special. Wait here. In 20 minutes, Ames returned with a white enamel lab tray in which were 2 dissected .38 Special cartridges. Using a pencil as a pointer, he commented on the disassembled elements. This is the case head in which the primer assembly is seated. The firing pin strikes here. This opening on the other side of the case head is the flash hole that leads from the primer packet to the powder compartment. There's no problem with this, no manufacturing errors. At the other end of the cartridge, you've got a lead semi-wad cutter bullet with a copper gas check crimped onto its base to retard bore leading. The tiny cannelures around the bullet are packed with grease to ease its passage through the barrel. Nothing out of order here either. And in between the case head and the bullet is the powder compartment, or it's sometimes called the combustion chamber, out of which I've taken this small pile of gray flaky material. This is nitrocellulose, a highly combustible material. It's ignited by the spark that comes through the flash hole from the primer. It explodes, ejecting the bullet from the cartridge. As you can see, there's enough nitrocellulose to fill the powder chamber. Just to be sure, I opened another round. Ames pointed the pencil at the second disassembled cartridge. There was nothing wrong with this either. The gunman was using well-made, reliable Remington ammunition. Officer Toke was just a lucky man, Father, a very lucky man. New York, New York. Jack Twist spent Christmas in the sanitarium room with Jenny, his wife of 13 years. Being with her on holidays was especially grim, but being anywhere else, leaving her alone, would have been grimmer. Although Jenny had spent almost 2/3 of their marriage in a coma, the years of lost communion had not diminished Jack's love for her. More than 8 years had passed since she had smiled at him or spoken his name or been able to return his kisses. But in his heart, at least, time was stopped, and she was still the beautiful Jenny May Alexander, a fresh-faced young bride. Incarcerated in that Central American prison, he had been sustained by the knowledge that Jenny waited at home for him, missed him, worried about him, and prayed each night for his safe return. Throughout his ordeal of torture and periodic starvation, he had clung to the hope that he would one day feel Jenny's arms around him and hear her marvelous laugh. That hope had kept him alive and sane. Of the 4 captured Rangers, only Jack and his buddy, Oscar Weston, survived and came home, though their escape was a near thing. They had waited almost a year to be rescued, confident that their country would not leave them to rot. Sometimes they debated whether they would be freed by commandos or through diplomatic channels. After 11 months, they still believed their countrymen would bail them out, but they no longer dared to wait. They had lost weight and were dangerously thin, undernourished. They had also suffered unknown tropical fevers without treatment, which had further debilitated them. Their only opportunity for escape was during one of their regular visits to the People's Center for Justice. Every 4 weeks, Jack and Oscar had been taken from their cells and driven to the People's Center, a clean, well-lighted, unwalled, unbarred institution in the heart of the capital, a model prison meant to impress foreign journalists with the current regime's humanitarianism. There they were given showers, deloused, put in clean clothes, handcuffed to prevent gesturing, and seated before videotape cameras to be politely questioned. Usually they answered questions with obscenities or wisecracks. The answers did not matter because the tape was edited, and answers they had never made were dubbed in by linguists who could speak unaccented English. Once the propaganda film had been made, they were interviewed over closed-circuit television by foreign reporters gathered in another room. The camera never provided close-ups of them, and their answers were not heard by those who asked the questions. Instead, once again, unseen intelligence men, stationed at another microphone outside the camera's range, answered for them. At the start of their 11th month in captivity, Jack and Oscar began making plans to escape the next time they were transported to that far less secure, less heavily guarded propaganda facility. The once formidable strength of their young bodies had been leached away, and their only weapons were shivs and needles made of rat bones, which they had painstakingly shaped and sharpened by rubbing them against the stone walls of the cells. Wickedly sharp, those instruments nevertheless made pathetic weapons. Yet Jack and Oscar hoped to triumph over gun-toting guards. Surprisingly, they did triumph. Once inside the People's Center, they were remanded into the custody of a single guard, who escorted them to the showers on the 2nd floor. The guard kept his gun holstered, probably because the facility was a detention center inside the larger detention center of the capital city itself. The guard was certain Jack and Oscar were demoralized, weak, and unarmed, so he was surprised when they suddenly turned on him and, with shocking savagery, stabbed him with the bone shivs they had concealed in their clothes. Pierced twice in the throat, his right eye skewered, he succumbed without producing a scream that might have drawn other police or soldiers. Before the break was discovered, Jack and Oscar confiscated the dead guard's handgun and ammunition, then made bold use of the hallways, risking notice, alarm, and capture. But it was, after all, a minimum security, quote-unquote, re-education center, and they were able to make their way to a stairwell and down to a dimly lighted basement, where they progressed swiftly and stealthily through a series of musty storage rooms. At the end of the building, they found the loading docks and a way out. 7 or 8 large boxes had just been offloaded from a delivery truck, which was backed up to the nearest of the 2 big bays, and the driver was engaged in an argument with another man. Both of them were shaking clipboards at each other. Those 2 were the only men in sight, and as they turned and headed toward a glass-enclosed office, Jack and Oscar raced silently to the recently unloaded boxes, and from there into the back of the delivery truck, where they made a nest for themselves behind the as-yet undelivered packages. In a few minutes, the driver returned, cursing, slammed the truck's cargo bay door, and drove away into the city before the alarm sounded. 10 minutes and many blocks from the People's Center, the truck stopped. The driver unbolted the rear doors, took out a single package without realizing Jack and Oscar were inches from him, behind a wall of boxes, and went into the building before which he'd parked. Extricating themselves from their burrow, Jack and Oscar fled. Within a few blocks, they found themselves in a district of muddy streets and dilapidated shanties, where the poverty-stricken residents were no fonder of the new tyrants than they had been of the old, and were willing to hide 2 Yankees on the lam. After nightfall, supplied with what little food the slum dwellers could spare, they departed for the outskirts. When they came to open farmland, they broke into a barn and stole a sharp sickle, several withered apples, a leather blacksmith's apron, and some burlap bags which could be used to fashion makeshift shoes when their shabby prison issue eventually fell apart, and a horse. Before dawn, they had reached the edge of the true jungle, where they abandoned the horse and set out on foot once more. Weak, poorly provisioned, armed only with the sickle and the gun they had taken off the guard, without a compass and therefore required to plot a course by the sun and the stars, they headed north through the tropical forest toward the border 80 miles away. Throughout that nightmare journey, Jack had one vital aid to survival: Jenny. He thought of her, dreamed of her, longed for her, and 7 days later, when he and Oscar reached friendly territory, Jack knew that he had made it as much because of Jenny as because of his ranger training. At that point, he thought the worst was behind him. He was wrong. Now, sitting beside his wife's bed with Christmas music on the tape deck, Jack Twist was suddenly overcome with grief. Christmas was a bad time because he could not help but remember how dreams of her had sustained him through his Christmas in prison, when in fact she had already been in a coma and lost to him. Happy holidays. Chicago, Illinois. As Father Stefan Wykazik moved through the halls and wards of St. Joseph's Hospital for Children, his spirits soared. That was no small thing, for he was already in a buoyant and elevated state. The hospital was crowded with visitors, and Christmas music issued from the public address system. Mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, grandparents, other relatives, and friends of the young patients were on hand with gifts, goodies, and good wishes. And there was more laughter in that usually grim place than one might ordinarily hear echoing through its chambers in an entire month. Even most of the seriously afflicted patients were smiling broadly and talking animatedly, their suffering forgotten for the time being. Nowhere in the hospital was there more hope or laughter than among those people gathered around the bed of 10-year-old Emmeline Halberg. When Father Wykazik introduced himself, he was greeted warmly by Emmy Halberg's parents, 2 sisters, grandparents, 1 aunt, and 1 uncle, who assumed he was one of the hospital's chaplains. Because of what he learned from Brendan Cronin yesterday, Stefan expected to find a happily mending little girl, But he was unprepared for Emmy's condition. She was positively glowing. Only 2 weeks ago, according to Brendan, she had been crippled and dying. But now her dark eyes were clear. Her former pallor was gone, replaced by a wholesome flush. Her knuckles and wrists were not swollen, and she seemed to be completely free of pain. She looked not like a sick child valiantly fighting her way back to health. Rather, she seemed already cured. Most startling of all, Emmy was not lying in bed, but standing with the aid of crutches, moving among her delighted and admiring relatives. Her wheelchair was gone. "Well," Stefan said after a brief visit, "I must be going, Emmy. I only stopped by to wish you a Merry Christmas from a friend of yours, Brendan Cronin." "Pudge," she said happily. "He's wonderful, isn't he? It was awful when he stopped working here. We miss him a lot." Emmy's mother said, "I never met this Pudge, but from the way the kids talked about him, he must have been good medicine for them." "He only worked here 1 week," Emmy said, "but he comes back. Did you know? Every few days he comes back to visit. I was hoping he'd come today so I could give him a big Christmas kiss." "He wanted to stop by, but he's spending Christmas with his folks." "Oh, that's good. That's what Christmas is for, isn't it, Father? Being together with your folks, having fun and loving each other." "Yes, Emmy," Stefan Weigesick said, thinking that no theologian or philosopher could have put it better. That's what Christmas is for. If Stefan had been alone with the girl, he would have asked her about the afternoon of December 11th. That was the day Brendan had been brushing her hair while she sat in her wheelchair before this very window. Stefan wanted to know about the rings on Brendan's hands, which had appeared for the first time that day, and which Emmeline had noticed before Brendan himself spotted them. He wanted to ask Emmy if she had felt anything unusual when Brendan had touched her, but there were too many adults around and they would surely ask awkward questions. Stefan was not yet prepared to reveal the reasons for his curiosity. Las Vegas, Nevada. After getting off to a rocky start, Christmas at the Monatella apartment improved dramatically. Mary and Pete stopped hammering Georgia with their well-meant but unwanted advice and criticism. They loosened up and involved themselves in Marcy's play the way grandparents should, and Georgia was reminded of just why she loved them so much. The holiday dinner was on the table at 12:50, only 20 minutes late, and it was delicious. By the time Marcy sat down to eat, she had worked off her all-consuming interest in Little Miss Doctor, and she did not rush through her meal. It was a leisurely dinner with much chit-chat and laughter, the Christmas tree twinkling in the background. Those were golden hours until, during dessert, the trouble started with surprising suddenness. With frightening speed, it escalated to total disaster. Teasing Marcy, Pete said, "Where does a little bitty thing like you put so much food? You've eaten more than the rest of us combined." "Oh, Grandpa." "It's true. You've really been shoveling it in. One more bite of that pumpkin pie and you're going to explode." Marcy lifted another forkful, held it up for all to see, and with great theatricality she moved it toward her mouth. "No, don't," Pete said, putting his hands in front of his face as if to protect himself from the blast. Marcy popped the morsel into her mouth, chewed and swallowed. "See, I didn't explode." "You will with the next bite," Pete said. "I was just 1 bite too soon. You'll explode, or else we'll have to rush you to the hospital." Marcy frowned. "No hospital." "Oh, yes," Pete said. "You'll be all swollen up, ready to burst, and we'll have to rush you to the hospital and have them deflate you." "No hospital," Marcy repeated adamantly. Georgia realized that her daughter's voice had changed, that the girl was no longer participating in the game, but was instead genuinely, if inexplicably, frightened. She was not scared of exploding, of course, but evidently the mere thought of a hospital had caused her to go pale. "No hospital," Marcy repeated, a haunted look in her eyes. "Oh, yes," Pete said, not yet aware of the change in the child. Georgia tried to deflect him. Dad, I think but Pete said, of course, they won't take you in an ambulance because you'll be too big. We'll have to rent a truck to haul you. The girl shook her head violently. I won't go to a hospital in a million years. I won't ever let those doctors touch me. Honey, Georgia said, Grandpa's only teasing. He doesn't really. Placated. The girl said, those hospital people will hurt me like they hurt me before. I won't let them hurt me again. Mary looked at Georgia baffled. When was she in the hospital? She wasn't, Georgia said. I don't know why I was. They tied me down in bed, stuck me full of needles, and I was scared, and I won't ever let them touch me again. Remembering the strange tantrum that Kara Pershagian had reported yesterday, Georgia moved swiftly to forestall a similar scene. She put one hand on Marcy's shoulder and said, Honey, you were never... I was! The girl's anger and fear burgeoned into rage and terror. She threw her fork, and Pete ducked to avoid being hit by it. Marcy! Georgia cried. The girl slipped off her chair and backed away from the table, white-faced. I'm going to grow up and be my own doctor so nobody else will stick needles in me. Words gave way to a pitiful moaning. Georgia went after Marcy, reaching for her. Honey, don't. Marcy held her hands out in front of her as if warding off an attack, although it was not her mother that she feared. She was looking through Georgia, perhaps seeing some imaginary threat, though her terror was real. She was not merely pale, but translucent, as if the very substance of her was evaporating in the tremendous heat of her terror. Marcy, what is it? The girl stumbled backward into a corner, shuddering. Georgia gripped her daughter's defensively raised hands. Marcy, talk to me. But even as Georgia spoke, a sudden stench of urine filled the air, and she saw a dark stain spreading from the crotch down both legs of Marcy's jeans. Marcy! The girl was trying to scream, but could not. What's happening? Mary asked. What's wrong? I don't know, Georgia said. God help me, I don't know. With her eyes still focused on some figure or object that remained visible only to her, Marcy began a wordless keening. New York, New York. The tape deck still played Christmas music, and Jenny Twist lay immobile and insensate. But Jack no longer engaged in the frustrating one-way communication with which he had filled the first few hours of his visit. Now he sat in silence, and inevitably his thoughts drifted back through the years to his homecoming from Central America. Upon returning to the States, he had discovered that the rescue of the prisoners at the Institute of Brotherhood had been misrepresented in some quarters as a terrorist act, a mass kidnapping, a provocation meant to spark a war. He and every ranger involved were painted as criminals in uniform, and those taken prisoner were for some reason the special focus of the opposition's anger. In a political panic, Congress had banned all covert activities in Central America, including a pending plan to rescue the 4 rangers. Their release was to be arranged strictly through diplomatic channels. That was why they had waited in vain for rescue. Their country had abandoned them. At first, Jack had trouble believing it. When at last he believed it, it was the second worst shock of his life. Having won his freedom, home again, Jack was relentlessly pursued by hostile journalists and subpoenaed to appear before a congressional committee to testify about his involvement in the raid. He expected to have a chance to set the record straight, but he quickly discovered that they weren't interested in his viewpoint, and that the televised hearing was merely an opportunity for politicians to do some grandstanding in the infamous tradition of Joe McCarthy. In a few months, most people had forgotten him, and when he regained the pounds he had lost in prison, they ceased to recognize him as the alleged war criminal they had seen on television. But the pain and the sense of betrayal continued to burn fiercely in him. If being abandoned by his country was the second worst shock of his life, The worst was what happened to Jenny when he had been stuck in that Central American prison. A thug had accosted her in the hallway of her own apartment building as she was coming home from work. He put a gun to her head, hustled her into her apartment, sodomized and raped her, clubbed her brutally with his pistol, and left her for dead. When Jack came home at last, he found Jenny in a state institution comatose. The level of care she'd been getting was abominable. Norman Hazard, the rapist who attacked Jenny, had been tracked down through fingerprints and witnesses, but a clever defense attorney had managed to delay the trial. Undertaking an investigation of his own, Jack satisfied himself that Hazard, with a history of violent sex offenses, was the guilty man. He also became convinced that Hazard would be acquitted on a technicality. Throughout his ordeal with the press and politicians, Jack made plans for the future. There were two primary tasks ahead of him. First, he would kill Norman Hazard in such a way as to avoid any suspicion falling upon himself. Second, he would get enough money to move Jenny to a private sanitarium, though the only way to obtain so much cash in a hurry was to steal it. As an elite ranger, he was trained in most weapons, explosives, martial arts, and survival techniques. His society had failed him, but it had also provided him with the knowledge and the means by which he could extract his revenge, and it had taught him how to break whatever laws stood in his way without punishment. Norman Hazard died in an accidental gas explosion 2 months after Jack returned to the States, and 2 weeks later, Jenny's transference to a private sanitarium was financed by the proceeds from an ingenious bank robbery executed with military precision. The murder of Hazard did not satisfy Jack. In fact, it depressed him. Killing in a war was different from killing in civilian life. He did not have the detachment to kill except in self-defense. Robbery, however, was enormously appealing. After the successful bank job, he'd been excited, exalted, exhilarated. Daring robbery had a medicinal quality. Crime gave him a reason to live, until recently. Now, sitting at Jenny's bedside, Jack Twist wondered what would keep him going day after day, if not grand larceny. The only other thing he had was Jenny. However, he no longer needed to provide for her. He had already piled up more than enough money for that. So his only reason for living was to come here several times a week, look upon her serene face, hold her hand, and pray for a miracle. It was ironic that a man like him, a hard-headed, self-reliant individualist, should have no hope but mysticism. As he brooded on that, he heard Jenny make a soft gurgling sound. She took 2 quick deep breaths and produced a long rattling sigh. For one crazy moment, as he rose from his chair, Jack half expected to find her eyes open, filled with awareness for the first time in more than 8 years. The miracle having come to pass, even as he had been daydreaming of it. But her eyes were closed and her face was slack. He put a hand against her face, then moved it to her throat. He felt for her pulse. What had happened was not, in fact, miraculous, but anti-miraculous, mundane, and inevitable. Jenny Twist had died. Chicago, Illinois. Few physicians were on duty at St. Joseph's at Christmas, but a resident named Jarville and an intern named Kleinett were eager to talk to Father Wykazik about Emmeline Halberg's amazing recovery. Kleinett, an intense, wiry-haired young man, escorted Stefan to a consultation room to review Emmy's file and x-rays. 5 weeks ago, she was started on namiloxaprine, a new drug just approved by the FDA. Dr. Jarville, the resident, was soft-spoken with heavy-lidded eyes, but when he joined them in the consultation room, he too was visibly excited by Emmeline Halberg's dramatic turn for the better. Namiloxaprine has several effects in bone diseases like Emmy's, Jarville said. In many instances, it puts a stop to the destruction of the periosteum, promotes the growth of healthy osteocytes, and somewhat induces the accumulation of intercellular calcium. And in a case like Emmy's, where the bone marrow is the primary target of the disease, naloxone creates an unusual chemical environment in the marrow cavity and in the Haversian canals, an environment that's extremely hostile to microorganisms, but actually encourages the growth of marrow cells, the production of blood cells, and hemoglobin formation. But it's not supposed to work this fast, Kleinert said. And it's basically a stop-loss drug, Jarville said. It can arrest the progress of a disease, put a stop to bone deterioration, but it doesn't make regeneration possible. Sure, it's supposed to promote some reconstruction, but not the kind of rebuilding we're seeing in Emmy. Fast rebuilding, Kleinert said, smacking his forehead with the heel of his hand, as if to knock this amazing fact into his unwilling brain. They showed Stefan a series of x-rays taken over the past 6 weeks, in which the changes in Emmy's bones and joints were obvious. Kleinert said she'd been on naloxone for 3 weeks without noticeable effect, and then suddenly 2 weeks ago, her body not only went into a state of remission, but began rebuilding damaged tissues. The timing of the girl's turnaround coincided perfectly with the first appearance of the strange rings on Brendan Cronin's hands. However, Stefan Wygazik made no mention of that coincidence. Jarville produced more x-rays and tests that showed a remarkable improvement in the child's Haversian canals, the elaborate network that carried small blood vessels and lymphatics throughout the bone for the purpose of maintenance and repair. Many of these had been clogged with a plaque-like substance that pinched off the vessels passing through them. In the past 2 weeks, however, the plaque almost disappeared, allowing the full circulation required for healing and regeneration. No one even knew that naloxone could clean out the canals this way. Jarville said no record of it. Oh, yes, minor unclogging, but only as a consequence of getting the disease itself under control. Nothing like this. Amazing. If regeneration continues at this rate, Kleinert said, Emmy could be a normal, healthy girl in 3 months. Really phenomenal. Jarville said she could be well again. They grinned at Father Wygazik, and he did not have the heart to suggest that neither their hard work nor the wonder drug was responsible for Emmeline Halborg's cure. They were euphoric, so Stefan kept to himself the possibility that Emmy's cure had been effected by some power far more mysterious than modern medicine. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Christmas Day with Lucy, Frank, and the grandchildren was fun and therapeutic for Ernie and Faye Block. By the time they went out for a walk, just the two of them, toward the end of the afternoon, they were feeling better than they had in months. The weather was perfect for walking, cold, crisp, but without wind. The most recent snowfall was 4 days old, so the sidewalks were clear. As twilight approached, the air shimmered with a purple radiance. Bundled in heavy coats and scarves, Faye and Ernie strolled arm in arm, talking animatedly about the day's events, enjoying the Christmas displays that Lucy's and Frank's neighbors had erected on their front lawns. The years slipped away, and Faye felt as if she and Ernie were still newlyweds, young and full of dreams. From the moment they had arrived in Milwaukee on December 15th, 10 days ago, Faye had reason to hope that everything was going to work out all right. Ernie had seemed better, a new bounciness in his step, more genuine good humor in his smile. Evidently, just basking in the love of his daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren was sufficient to burn away some of the crippling fear that had become the central fact of his life. The therapy sessions with Dr. Fontaine, 6 so far, had also been remarkably beneficial. Ernie was still afraid of the dark, but far less terrified than when they left Nevada. Phobias, according to the doctor, were easy to treat compared to many other psychiatric disorders. In recent years, therapists had discovered that in most cases, the symptoms were the disease rather than merely shadows cast by unresolved conflicts in the patient's subconscious. It was no longer considered necessary or even possible or desirable to seek the psychological causes of the condition in order to treat it. Long courses of therapy have been abandoned in favor of teaching the patient desensitization techniques that could eradicate the symptoms in months or even weeks. Approximately a third of all phobics could not be helped by these methods and instead required long-term treatment and even panic-blocking drugs like alprazolam. But Ernie had improved at a pace that even Dr. Fontaine, an optimist by nature, found astonishing. Faye had been reading extensively about phobias and had discovered she could help Ernie by digging up amusing, curious facts that allowed him to view his condition from a different, less fearsome perspective. He was especially fond of hearing about bizarre phobias that made his terror of the dark seem reasonable by comparison. For example, knowing there were pteranophobics out there, people who lived in constant and unreasonable fear of feathers, made his abhorrence of nightfall seem not only bearable, but almost ordinary and logical as well. Ichthyophobes were horrified by the prospect of encountering a fish, and pediophobes ran screaming at the sight of a doll. And Ernie's nyctophobia was certainly preferable to coidophobia, the fear of sexual intercourse, and not a fraction as debilitating as autophobia, the fear of oneself. Now, walking through the twilight, Faye tried to keep Ernie's mind off the descending darkness by telling him about the late author John Cheever, winner of the National Book Award, who had been gephairophobic. Cheever had suffered from a crippling fear of crossing high bridges. Ernie listened with fascination, but he was no less aware of the onset of nightfall. As the shadows lengthened across the snow, his hand steadily tightened on her arm until it would have been painful if she had not been wearing a thick sweater and heavy coat. By the time they had gone 7 blocks, they were too far from the house to have any hope of returning to it before full darkness settled on the land. 2/3 of the sky was black already, and the other third was deep purple. The shadows had spread like spilt ink. The streetlights had come on. Faye halted Ernie in a cone of light, giving him a brief reprieve. His eyes had a wild look, and his steaming exhalations rushed from him at a rate that indicated incipient panic. "Remember to control your breathing," Faye said. He nodded and began at once to take deeper, slower breaths. When all the light in the sky had been extinguished, she said, "Ready to go back?" "Ready," he said hollowly. They stepped out of the glow of the street lamp, into darkness, heading back toward the house, and Ernie hissed between clenched teeth. What they were engaged upon for the 3rd time was a dramatic therapeutic technique called flooding, in which the phobic was encouraged to confront the thing he feared and to endure it long enough to break its hold on him. Flooding is based on the fact that panic attacks are self-limiting. The human body cannot sustain a very high level of panic indefinitely, cannot produce endless adrenaline, so the mind must adapt to and make peace, or at least a truce, with what it fears. Unmodified flooding can be a cruel, barbaric method of cracking a phobia, for it puts the patient at risk of a breakdown. Dr. Fontaine preferred a modified version of the technique, involving 3 stages of confrontation with the source of fear. The first stage, in Ernie's case, was to put himself in darkness for 15 minutes, but with Faye at his side for support and with lighted areas easily accessible. Now, each time they arrived at the lighted sidewalk beneath the street lamp, they paused to let him gather his courage, then went on into the next patch of darkness. The second stage, which they would try in another week or 2 after more sessions with the doctor, would involve driving to a place where there were no street lamps, no easily reached lighted areas. There, they would walk together, arm in arm, across an unrelieved vista of darkness, until Ernie could tolerate no more, at which time Faye would switch on a flashlight and give him a moment's respite. In the third stage of treatment, Ernie would go for a stroll alone in a completely dark area. After a few outings like that, he would almost certainly be cured. But he was not cured yet, and by the time they covered 6 blocks of the 7-block return journey to the house, Ernie was breathing like a well-run racehorse, and he bolted for the safety of the light inside. Not bad, though, 6 blocks, better than before. At this rate, he would be cured in no time. As Faye followed him into the house, where Lucy was already helping him out of his coat, she tried to feel good about his progress to date. If this pace held, he would complete the third and final stage weeks, maybe even a couple of months ahead of schedule. That was what worried Faye. His rapid improvement was amazing. It seemed too rapid and too amazing to be real. She wanted to believe the nightmare would be put behind them quickly, but the pace of his recuperation made her wonder if it was lasting. Striving always to think positive, Faye Black was nevertheless plagued by the instinctive and unnerving feeling that something was wrong, very wrong. Boston, Massachusetts. Inevitably, given his exotic background as a godson of Picasso and a once famous European stage performer, Pablo Jackson was a star in Boston social circles. Furthermore, during World War II, he had been a liaison between British intelligence and the French resistance forces, and his recent work as a hypnotist with police agencies had only added to his mystique. He never lacked invitations. On the evening of Christmas Day, Pablo attended a black-tie dinner party for 22 at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Ira Hergensheimer in Brooklyn. The house was a splendid brick Georgian colonial, as elegant and warmly welcoming as the Hergensheimers themselves, who had made their money in real estate during the 1950s. A bartender was on duty in the library, and white-jacketed waiters circulated through the enormous drawing room with champagne and canapes, and in the foyer a string quartet played just loudly enough to provide pleasant background music. Among that engaging company, the man of most interest to Pablo was Alexander Christopherson, former ambassador to the Court of St. James's, one-term United States Senator from Massachusetts, later director of the Central Intelligence Agency, now retired almost a decade, whom Pablo had known half a century. Now 76, Christopherson was the second eldest guest, but old age had been nearly as kind to him as to Pablo. He was tall, distinguished, with remarkably few lines in his classic Bostonian face. His mind was as sharp as ever. The true length of his journey on the earth was betrayed only by a mild trace of Parkinson's disease, which, in spite of medication, left him with a tremor in his right hand. Half an hour before dinner, Pablo eased Alex away from the other guests and led him to Ira Hergensheimer's oak-paneled study adjacent to the library for a private conversation. The old magician closed the door behind them, and they carried their glasses of champagne to a pair of leather wingback chairs by the window. "Alex, I need your advice." "Well, as you know," Alex said, "men our age find it especially satisfying to give advice. It compensates for no longer being able to set a bad example ourselves. But I can't imagine what advice I could give on any problem that you wouldn't already have thought of yourself." "Yesterday," Pablo said, "a young woman came to see me. She's an exceedingly lovely, charming, and intelligent woman who's accustomed to solving her own problems. But now she's bumped up against something very strange. She desperately needs help." Alex raised his eyebrows. "Beautiful young women still come to you for help at 81? I am impressed, humbled, and envious, Pablo." This is not a coup de F-O-U-D-R-E. You filthy-minded old lizard. Passion isn't involved. Without mentioning Ginger Weiss's name or occupation, Pablo discussed her problem, the bizarre and inexplicable fugues, and recounted the session of hypnotic regression that had ended with her frightening withdrawal. She actually seemed about to retreat into a deep, self-induced coma, perhaps even into death, to avoid my questions. Naturally, I refused to put her in a trance again and risk another withdrawal of that severity, but I promised to do some research to see if any similar case was on record. I found myself poring through books most of last evening and this morning, searching for references to memory blocks with self-destruction built into them. At last I found it in one of your books. Of course, you were writing about an imposed psychological condition as a result of brainwashing, and this woman's block is of her own creation, but the similarity is there. Drawing on his experiences in the intelligence services during World War II and the subsequent Cold War, Alex Christopherson had written several books, including 2 that dealt with brainwashing. In one, Alex had described a technique he called the Azrael block, naming it for one of the angels of death. That seemed uncannily like the barrier that surrounded Ginger Weiss's memory of some traumatic event in her past. As distant string music came to them muffled by the closed study door, Alex put down his champagne glass because his hands trembled too violently. He said, I don't suppose you'd drop this matter and forget all about it, because I'm telling you that's the wisest course. Well, Pablo said, a bit surprised by the ominous tone of his friend's voice. I've promised her I'll try to help. I've been retired 8 years and my instincts aren't what they once were, but I have a very bad feeling about this. Drop it, Pablo. Don't see her again. Don't try to help her anymore. But, Alex, I've promised her. I was afraid that'd be your position. Alex folded his tremulous hands. Okay. The Azrael block. It's not something that Western intelligence services use often, but the Soviets find it invaluable. For example, let's imagine a top-notch Russian agent named Ivan, an operative with 30 years service in the KGB. In Ivan's memory, there will be an incredible amount of highly sensitive information that, were it to fall into Western hands, would devastate Russian espionage networks. Ivan's superiors constantly worry that, on some foreign assignment, he'll be identified and interrogated. As I understand it, with current drugs and hypnotic techniques, no one can withhold information from a determined interrogator. Exactly. No matter how tough he is, Ivan will spill all he knows without being tortured. For that reason, his superiors would prefer to send younger agents who, if caught, would have less valuable information to reveal. But many situations require a seasoned man like Ivan, so the possibility of all his knowledge falling into enemy hands is a nightmare with which his superiors must live whether they like it or not. The risk of doing business. Exactly. However, let's imagine that among all the sensitive knowledge in his head, Ivan knows 2 or 3 things that are especially sensitive, so explosive that their revelation could destroy his country. These particular memories, less than 1% of his knowledge about KGB operations, could be suppressed without affecting his performance in the field. We're talking here about the suppression of a very tiny portion of his memories. Then, if he fell into enemy hands, he'd still give up a great deal of valuable stuff during interrogation, but at least he would not be able to reveal those few most crucial memories. And this is where the Azrael block comes in, Pablo said. Ivan's own people used drugs and hypnosis to seal off certain parts of his past before sending him overseas on his next assignment. Alex nodded. For example, say that years ago, Ivan was one of the agents involved in the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II. With the memory block in place, his awareness of that involvement could be locked in his subconscious, beyond the reach of potential interrogators, without affecting his work on new assignments. But not just any block will do. If Ivan's interrogators discover a standard memory block, they'll work diligently to unlock it, because they'll know what lies behind it is of enormous importance. So the barrier must be one that cannot be tampered with. The Azrael block is perfect. When the subject is questioned about the forbidden topic, he's programmed to retreat into a deep coma where he cannot hear the inquisitioner's voice, and even into death. In fact, it should more accurately be called the Azrael trigger, because if the interrogator probes into the blocked memories, he pulls that trigger, shooting Ivan into a coma, and if he continues to pull the trigger, he may eventually kill the subject. Fascinated, Pablo said, "But isn't the survival instinct strong enough to overcome the block? When it comes to the point that Ivan must either remember and reveal what he has forgotten or die, well, surely the repressed memory would surface." No. Even in the warm amber light of the floor lamp beside his chair, Alex's face appeared to have gone gray. Not with the drugs and hypnotic techniques we have these days. Mind control is a frighteningly advanced science. The survival instinct is the strongest we've got, but even that can be overridden. Ivan can be programmed to self-destruct. Pablo found his champagne glass empty. My young lady friend seems to have invented a sort of Azrael block of her own to hide from herself some extraordinarily distressing event in her past. No, Alex said, she didn't form the block herself. She must have. She's in a bad state, Alex. She just slips away when I try to question her. So as you know this field, I thought you might have a few ideas about how I can deal with it. You still don't understand why I warned you to drop this whole thing, Alex said. He pushed up from his chair, moved to the nearby window, shoved his trembling hands in his pockets, and stared out at the snow-covered lawn. A self-imposed, naturally generated Azrael block? Such a thing is impossible. The human mind will not, of its own volition, put itself at risk of death merely to conceal something from itself. An Azrael block is always an externally applied control. If you've encountered such a barrier, then someone planted it in her mind. You're saying she's been brainwashed? Ridiculous. She's no spy. I'm sure she's not. She's no Russian. So why would she have been brainwashed? Ordinary citizens don't become targets for that sort of thing. Alex turned from the window and faced Pablo. This is just an educated guess, but perhaps she accidentally saw something she was not supposed to see, something extremely important, secret. Subsequently, she was subjected to a sophisticated process of memory repression to make sure she never told anyone about it. Pablo stared at him, astonished. But what could she possibly have seen to have made such extreme measures necessary? Alex shrugged. And who could have tampered with her mind? Alex said the Russians, the CIA, the Israeli Mossad, Britain's MI6, any organization with the knowledge of how such things are done. I don't think she's traveled outside the U.S., which leaves the CIA. Not necessarily. All the others operate in this country for their own purposes. Besides, intelligence organizations are not the only groups who are familiar with mind control techniques. So are some crackpot religious cults, fanatical political fringe groups, others. Knowledge spreads fast, and evil knowledge spreads faster. If people like that want her to forget something, you sure don't want to help her remember. It wouldn't be healthy for either you or her, Pablo. I can't believe, Alex said somberly. But these fugues, these sudden fears of black gloves and helmets, these would seem to indicate that her memory block is cracking. Yet the people you've mentioned wouldn't have done a half-baked job, would they? If they'd implanted a block, it would be perfect. Alex returned to his chair, sat, leaned forward, fixing Pablo with an intense gaze, obviously striving to impress him with the gravity of the situation. That's what worries me most, old friend. Ordinarily, such a firmly implanted mental barrier would never weaken on its own. The people capable of doing this to your lady friend are absolutely expert at it. They wouldn't screw up. So her recent problems, her deteriorating psychological condition, can mean only one thing. Yes, the forbidden memories, the secrets buried behind this Azrael block, are apparently so explosive, so frightening, so traumatic, that not even an expertly engineered barrier can contain them. Buried in this woman is a shocking memory of immense power, and it's straining to break out of its prison in her subconscious into her conscious mind. These objects that trigger her blackouts, the gloves, the sink drain, are very likely elements of those repressed memories. When she fixates on one of these things, she's close to a breakthrough, trembling on the edge of remembrance. Then her program kicks in and she blacks out. Pablo's heart quickened with excitement. Then, after all, it might be possible to use hypnotic regression to probe at this Azrael block, widen the cracks already in it, without driving her into a coma. One would have to be extremely cautious, of course, but with "You're not listening to me," Alex said, bolting up again. He stood between their chairs, looming over Pablo, pointing one trembling finger at him. "This is incredibly dangerous. You've stumbled into something much too big for you to handle. If you help her to remember, you're going to make powerful enemies somewhere. She's a sweet girl and her life is in ruins because of this. You can't help her. You're too old and you're just one man. Listen, maybe you don't understand enough of the situation. I haven't told you her name or profession, but I'll tell you now that I don't want to know who she is," Alex said, his eyes widening. "She's a physician," Pablo persisted, "or almost. She spent the past 14 years training herself for medical practice, and now she's losing everything. It's tragic. Think about this, damn it. She's almost certain to discover that knowing the truth is even worse than not knowing. If the repressed memories are breaking through like this, then they must be so traumatic that they could destroy her psychologically." "Maybe," Pablo acknowledged, "but shouldn't she be the one to decide whether or not to keep digging for the truth?" Alex was adamant. "If the memory itself doesn't destroy her, then she'll probably be killed by whoever implanted the block. I'm surprised they didn't kill her straight away. If it is an intelligence agency behind this, ours or theirs, then you've got to remember that to them, civilians are entirely expendable. She got a rare and amazing reprieve when they used brainwashing instead of a bullet. A bullet's quicker and cheaper. They won't give her a second reprieve. If they discover that the Azrael block has crumbled, if they learn that she's uncovered the secret they've hidden from her, they'll blow her brains out." "You can't be sure," Pablo said. "Besides, she's a real go-getter, Alex, an achiever, a mover and shaker. So, from her point of view, her current situation is almost as bad as having her brains blown out." Making no effort to conceal his frustration with the old magician, Alex said, "You help her and they'll blow your brains out as well. Doesn't that give you pause?" "At 81, Pablo said, not much of interest happens. You can't afford to turn your back on that rare bit of excitement when it comes along. Vogue la galère, I must chance it." "You're making a mistake." "Maybe I am, my friend, maybe. But then why do I feel so good?" Chicago, Illinois. Dr. Bennett Soniford, who had operated on Winton Toke yesterday, subsequent to the shooting at the sandwich shop, ushered Father Wykazik into a spacious den where the walls were covered with mounted fish, marlin, an immense albacore, bass, trout. More than 30 glass eyes stared sightlessly down upon the two men. A trophy case was filled with silver and gold cups, bowls, medallions. The doctor sat at a pine desk in the shadow of a forever swimming, open-mouthed marlin of startling proportions, and Stefan sat beside the desk in a comfortable chair. Although the hospital had provided only Dr. Sonneford's office number, Father Wyckowick had been able to track down the surgeon's home address with the aid of friends at the telephone company and police department. He had arrived at Sonneford's doorstep at 7:30 Christmas night, effusively apologetic about interrupting holiday celebrations. Now, Stefan said, Brendan works with me at St. Bernadette's, and I think very highly of him, so I don't want to see him in trouble. Sonneford, who looked a bit like a fish, pale, slightly protuberant eyes, a natural puckered mouth, said, Trouble? He opened a kit of small tools, choosing a miniature screwdriver, and turned his attention to a fly casting reel that lay on the blotter. What trouble? Interfering with officers in the performance of their duties. Ridiculous. Sonneford carefully removed tiny screws from the reel housing. If he had intended to talk, the man would be dead now. We gave him 4.5 liters. Really? That isn't a mistake on the patient's chart? No mistake. Sonneford removed the metal case from the automatic reel, peered intently into its mechanical guts. An adult has 70 milliliters of blood per kilogram of body weight. Tolk is a big man, 100 kilos. He normally contains 7 liters. So when I first ordered blood in the ER, he lost over 60% of his own. He put down the screwdriver and picked up an equally small wrench, and they gave him another liter in the ambulance before I saw him. You mean he'd actually lost over 75% of his blood by the time they got him out of that sandwich shop? But can a man lose so much blood and survive? No, Sonneford said quietly. A pleasant shiver passed through Stefan, and both bullets lodged in soft tissue but damaged no organs, deflected by ribs, other bones. Sonneford was still squinting at the reel but had stopped tinkering with it. If those 38s had hit bone, the impact would have resulted in chipping, splintering. I found nothing like that. On the other hand, if they were not deflected by bone, they should have passed through him, leaving massive exit wounds. But I found them lodged in muscle tissue. Stefan stared at the surgeon's bent head. Why do I have the feeling there's something more you want to tell me, but that it's something you're afraid to talk about? At last, Sonneford glanced up. And why do I get the feeling that you've not told the truth about your reasons for coming here, Father? Touché, Stefan said. Sonneford sighed and put the tools away in the kit. All right. The entry wounds make it clear that one bullet hit Tolk in the chest, impacted with the lower portion of the sternum, which should have snapped off or fractured. Splinters like shrapnel should have pierced organs, vital blood vessels. Apparently none of that happened. Why do you say apparently? Either it happened or it didn't. From the entry wound in the flesh, I know that bullet hit the sternum, Father, and I found it lodged harmlessly in tissue on the other side of the sternum. Therefore, somehow, it passed through that bone without damaging it. Impossible, of course. Yet I found just an entry wound over the sternum, the undamaged bone directly under the wound, and then the bullet lodged inside the sternum with no indication how it had gotten from one place to the other. Furthermore, the entry wound of the second slug was over the base of the fourth rib, right side, but that rib was undamaged as well. The bullet should have shattered it. Maybe you're wrong, Stefan said, playing devil's advocate. Maybe the bullet entered just slightly off the rib between ribs. No. Sonneford raised his head but did not look at Stefan. The physician's uneasiness still seemed peculiar and was not explained by what he had said thus far. I don't make diagnostic errors, Besides, inside the patient, those bullets were lodged where you'd expect them to be if they had hit bone, had punched through, and had had the last of their energy absorbed by the muscle. But there were no damaged tissues between the point of entry and the expended slugs, which is impossible. Bullets can't pass through a man's chest and leave no trail at all. Almost seems as if we have a minor miracle. More than minor, seems like a pretty damn major miracle to me. If only one artery and vein were injured, and if both were only nicked, how did Toke lose so much blood? Were those nicks big enough to account for it? No, he couldn't have hemorrhaged so massively from those traumas. The surgeon said nothing more. He seemed gripped in the talons of some dark fear that Stefan could not understand. What had he to fear? If he believed that he had witnessed a miracle, should he not be joyous? Doctor, I know it's difficult for a man of science and medicine to admit he's seen something that his education can't explain, something that in fact is in opposition to everything he had believed to be true. But I beg you to tell me everything you saw. What are you holding back? How did Winton Toke lose so much blood if his injuries were so small? Soniford slumped back in his chair. In surgery, after beginning transfusions, I located the bullets on the x-rays and made the necessary incisions to remove them. In the process, I found a tiny hole in the superior mesenteric artery and another small tear in one of the superior intercostal veins. I was certain there must be other severed vessels, but I couldn't locate them immediately, so I clamped off both the superior mesenteric and the intercostal for repair, figuring to search further when those were attended to. It only took a few minutes, an easy task. I sewed the artery first, of course, because the bleeding was in spurts and was more serious. Then, Father Wexick urged gently. Then, when I had quickly finished stitching the artery, I turned to the torn intercostal vein, and the tear was gone. Gone, Stefan said. A quiver of awe passed through him, for this was the thing he had expected. It was also a revelation of such astounding importance that it seemed too much to have hoped for. Gone, Soniford repeated, and at last he met Stefan's gaze. In the surgeon's watery gray eyes, a shadow moved like the half-perceived passage of a leviathan through the depths of a murky sea. The shadow of fear, and Stefan confirmed that for some inexplicable reason, the miracle occasioned dread in the doctor. The torn vein healed itself, Father. I know the tear had been there, clamped it off myself. My technician saw it, my nurse saw it. But when I was ready to sew it up, the rent was gone, healed. I removed the clamps and the blood flowed again through the vein, and there was no leakage. And later, when I excised the bullets, the muscle tissue appeared to knit up before my eyes. Appeared to? No, that's an evasion, Soniford admitted. It did knit before my eyes. Incredible, but I saw it. Can't prove it, Father, but I know those two slugs did smash Toke's sternum and shatter his rib. They did send bone fragments through him like shrapnel. Major mortal damage was done, had to have been, but by the time he was on the table in surgery, his body had almost entirely healed itself. The shattered bones had reformed. The superior mesenteric artery and the intercostal vein were severed to begin with, which is why he lost blood so fast. But by the time I opened him, both vessels had knitted up except for a small tear in each. Sounds crazy, but if I hadn't moved to repair the artery, I'm sure it would have finished closing on its own, just as the vein did. What did your nurse and other assistants think of this? Funny thing is, we didn't talk much about it. I can't account for how little we discussed it. Maybe we didn't talk about it because We're living in a rational age when the miraculous is unacceptable. How sad if true, Stefan said. With the shadow of dread still shimmering, anemone-like in the depths of his eyes, Soniford said, Father, if there is a God, and I'm not admitting there is, why would he save this particular cop? He's a good man, Father Waxsick said. So, I've seen hundreds of good men die. Why should this one be saved and none of the others? Father Waxsick pulled a chair around from the side of the desk in order to be able to sit near the surgeon. You've been frank with me, doctor, so I'll be upfront with you. I sense a force behind these events that's more than human. A presence. And that presence isn't primarily concerned with Winton Toke, but with Brendan, the man, the priest who first reached Officer Toke in that sandwich shop. Bennett Soniford blinked in surprise. Oh, but you wouldn't have gotten such a notion unless Brendan was linked to at least one other miraculous event, Stefan said. Without using Emmy Halborg's name, he told Soniford about the girl's mending limbs that had once been crippled by disease. Instead of taking hope from what Stefan told him, Bennett Soniford shriveled farther in the heat of his strange despair. Frustrated by the physician's relentless gloominess, Father Waxsick said, Doctor, maybe I'm missing something, but it seems to me you've got every reason to be joyous. You were privileged to witness what I personally believe was the hand of God at work. He held one hand out to Soniford and was not surprised when the doctor gripped it tightly. Bennett, why are you so despondent? Soniford cleared his throat and said, I was born and raised a Lutheran, but for 25 years I've been an atheist, and now... Stefan said, I see. Happily, Stefan began angling for Bennett Soniford's soul in the fish-line den. He had no suspicion that, before the day was done, his current euphoria would be dispelled and that he would experience a bitter disappointment. Reno, Nevada. Zeb Lomack had never imagined that his life would end in bloody suicide on Christmas, but by that night he had sunk so low that he longed to end his existence. He loaded his shotgun, put it on the filthy kitchen table, and promised himself that he would use it if he was unable to get rid of all the goddamn moon stuff before midnight. His bizarre fascination with the moon had begun the summer before last, though at first it had seemed innocent enough. Toward the end of August that year, he had taken to going out on the back porch of his cozy little house and watching the moon and stars while sipping Coors. In mid-September, he purchased a Tasco 10 VR refracting telescope and bought a couple of books on amateur astronomy. Zebediah was surprised by his own sudden interest in stargazing. For most of his 50 years, Zeb Lomack, a professional gambler, had shown little interest in anything but cards. He worked Reno, Lake Tahoe, Vegas, occasionally one of the smaller gambling towns like Elko or Bullhead City. Playing poker with the tourists and local would-be poker champs. He was not only good at card games, he loved cards more than he loved women, booze, food. Even the money was not important to Zeb. It was just a handy byproduct of playing cards. The important thing was staying in the game. Until he got the telescope and went crazy. For a couple of months, he used the scope on a casual basis, and he bought a few more books on astronomy, and it was just a hobby. But by last Christmas, he began to focus his attention less on the stars than on the moon, and thereafter something strange happened to him. The new hobby soon became as interesting as card games, and he found himself canceling planned excursions to the casinos in order to study the lunar surface. By February, he was glued to the eyepiece of the Tasco every night that the moon was visible. By April, he built a collection of books about the moon that numbered more than 100, and he went out to play cards only 2 or 3 nights a week. By the end of June, his book collection had grown to 500 titles, and he had begun to paper the bedroom walls and ceiling with pictures of the moon clipped from old magazines and newspapers. He no longer played cards, but began living off his savings, and thereafter his interest in things lunar ceased to bear any resemblance to a hobby and became a mad obsession. By September, his book collection had grown to more than 1,500 volumes stacked throughout his small house. During the day, he read about the moon, or more often, sat for hours staring intently at photographs of it, unable either to understand or to resist its allure, until its craters and ridges and plains became as familiar to him as the 5 rooms of his own house. On those nights when the moon was visible, he studied it through the telescope until he could no longer stay awake, until his eyes were bloodshot and sore. Before this obsession took control of him, Zeb Lomack had been a ruggedly hewn and relatively fit man. But as his preoccupation with things lunar tightened its grip, he stopped exercising and began eating junk food. Cake, ice cream, TV dinners, bologna sandwiches, because he no longer had time to prepare good meals. Furthermore, the moon not only fascinated him, but also made him uneasy, filled him not only with wonder, but with dread. So he was always nervous, and he tranquilized himself with food. He became softer, flabbier, though he was only minimally aware of the physical changes he was undergoing. By early October, he thought about the moon every hour of every day, dreamed of it, and could go nowhere in his house without seeing hundreds of images of the lunar face. He had not stopped repapering the walls when he had finished his bedroom in June, but had carried that project throughout. The full color and black and white moon pictures came from astronomy journals, magazines, books, and newspapers. On one of his infrequent ventures out of the house, he had seen a 3 by 5 foot poster of the moon, a color photograph taken by astronauts, and he had bought 50 copies, enough to paper the ceiling and every wall in the living room. He had even taped the poster over the windows, so every square inch of the room was decorated with that repeating image except for doorways. He moved the furniture out, transforming the empty chamber into a planetarium where the show never changed. Sometimes he'd lie on his back on the floor and stare up and around at those 50 moons, transported by an exhilarating sense of wonder and an inexplicable terror, neither of which he could understand. Christmas night, as Zeb was sprawled on the floor with 100 bloated moons hanging over him, bearing down on him, he suddenly noticed writing on one of them. A single word scrawled across the lunar image with a felt-tip pen, where there had never been a word before. The picture had been defaced with the name, Dominic. He recognized his own handwriting, but he could not remember having scrawled that name across the moon. Then his eye was caught by another name written on another poster, Ginger, and then a third name on a third poster, Faye, and a fourth, Ernie. Suddenly anxious, Zeb stumbled around the room checking the other posters, but he found no more names. In addition to being unable to recall writing those words, he could not think of anyone he knew named Dominic, Ginger, or Faye. He knew a couple of Ernies, though neither was a close friend, and the appearance of that name on one of the moons was no less mysterious than the 3 others. Staring at the names, he grew increasingly uneasy, for he had the odd feeling that he did know them, that they had played a terribly important role in his life, and that his very sanity and survival depended on remembering who they were. Some long-forgotten memory swelled in him like a steadily inflating balloon, and intuitively he knew that when the balloon popped, he would recollect everything, not only the identities of these 4 people, but also the origins of his fevered fascination with and underlying fear of the moon. But as the memory balloon swelled within him, his fear grew as well, and he began to sweat and then to shake uncontrollably. He turned from the poster, suddenly terrified of remembering, and lurched out to the kitchen, driven by that gnawing hunger that was always occasioned by thoughts that made him nervous. He wrenched open the refrigerator door and was startled to discover that the shelves were bare. They held dirty bowls and empty plastic containers in which food had been kept, 2 empty milk cartons, an egg carton with 1 broken and dried egg. He looked in the freezer, found only frost. Zeb tried to remember when he had last been to the supermarket. It might have been days or weeks since his most recent shopping expedition. He could not remember because, in his moon-filled world, time no longer had any meaning. And how much time had passed since his last meal? He vaguely remembered having some canned pudding, but he was not clear whether that had been earlier today, or yesterday, or even 2 days ago. Zebediah Lomack was so shocked by this development that his mind cleared for the first time in weeks, and when he looked around the kitchen, he made a strangled sound of disgust and fear. For the first time, he really saw, the mess in which he'd been living, a situation previously masked by his all-encompassing fascination with the moon. Garbage covered the floor, discarded cans sticky with fruit juice, slimy with traces of rancid gravy, empty cereal boxes and a score of drained milk cartons, dozens of watered up and discarded potato chip bags and candy wrappers, and roaches. They squirmed, scuttled, and jigged through the garbage, raced across the floor, climbed walls, crouched on counters, and lurked in the sink. "My God," Zeb said in a voice that was hardly more than a croak. "What's happened to me? What have I been doing? What's wrong with me?" He put one hand to his face and twitched with surprise when he felt a beard. He had always been clean-shaven, and he had thought he shaved just this morning. The wiry hair on his face sent him in a panic to the bathroom, where he could look in the mirror. He saw a stranger. Filthy, matted hair hanging in tangled clumps, pale, soft, sickly-looking skin, a 2-week beard crusted with food and dirt, wild eyes. He became aware of his body odor. His sink was so rank that he gagged on his own aroma. Apparently he had not bathed in days, weeks. He needed help. He was sick, confused and sick. He could not understand what had happened to him, but he knew that he must go to the telephone and call for help. But he did not go immediately to the phone because he was afraid they'd say he was hopelessly insane and would lock him away forever, like they locked away his father. When Zebediah was 8, his father pitched a terrible fit, ranting and raving about lizard things that were crawling out of the walls, and the doctors took him to the hospital to dry him out. But that time, unlike before, the DTs had not gone away, and Zeb's dad had been institutionalized for the rest of his life. Ever after, Zeb had been afraid his own mind might be flawed too. Staring at his pale face in the mirror, he knew he could not call for help until he made himself presentable and straightened up the house. Otherwise, they would lock him up and throw away the key. He could not bear to look at his reflection long enough to shave, so he decided to deal with the house first. Keeping his head down to avoid seeing the moons, which exerted a tidal force on him as real as the true moon's effect on the seas, he scurried into the bedroom, opened the closet, shoved the clothes aside, located his Remington 12-gauge in a box of shells. Head bowed, fighting the urge to look up, he made his way to the kitchen, where he loaded the shotgun and put it on the garbage-strewn table. Speaking aloud, he made a bargain with himself. "You get rid of the moon books, tear down the pictures so this place don't look so crazy, clean the kitchen, shave, bathe, then maybe you'll get your head clear enough to figure what the hell's wrong with you. Then you can get help, just not while things are like this." The shotgun was the unspoken part of the bargain. He had been fortunate to rise briefly out of the moon dream in which he had been living, shocked to his senses by the lack of food in the refrigerator. But if he drifted back into that nightmare, he could not count on being jolted awake again. Therefore, if he could not resist the siren song of the moons on the walls, he would quickly return to the kitchen, pick up the shotgun, put it in his mouth, and pull the trigger. Death was better than this, and death was better than being locked up forever like his father. Now, in the living room once more, keeping his eyes on the floor, he began to gather up the books. Some had once boasted jackets with photos of the moon, but he had clipped those pictures. He hefted an armload of them and went outside to the snow-covered backyard, where there was a barbecue pit lined with concrete blocks. Shivering in the crisp winter air, he dumped the books into the pit and headed back to the house for more, not daring to look at the night sky for fear of the great luminous body suspended in it. As he worked, the urge to return to the study of the moon was as intense and demanding as the hideous need that forced a heroin addict to return again and again to the needle, but Zeb fought it. Likewise, as he made trip after trip to the barbecue pit, he felt that memory of some long-forgotten event continuing to swell within him. Dominic, Ginger, Faye, Ernie. Instinctively, he knew that he would understand the cause of his fascination with the moon, if only he could recall who those 4 people were. He concentrated on the names, trying to use them to block out the alluring summons of the moon, and it seemed to work because soon he had disposed of 200 or 300 volumes in the barbecue pit and was ready to set them ablaze. But when he struck a match and leaned down to light the pages of a book, he discovered the pit was empty. He stared in shock and horror. Dropping the matches, he raced back to the house, threw open the kitchen door, stumbled inside, and saw what he had been most afraid of seeing. The books were piled there, damp with snow, smeared with wet ashes from the pit. He had indeed disposed of them, but then the lunacy had taken him again. Under its spell, and without knowing what he was doing, he had carried every volume back into the house. He began to cry, but he was still determined he would not wind up in a padded room. He picked up a score of books and headed back toward the barbecue pit, feeling as if he were in hell and condemned for eternity to the performance of this frantic ritual. When he figured he had filled the pit again, he suddenly realized he was not carrying books to the place of burning, but away from it. Again he had drifted off into his moon dream, and instead of destroying the objects of his obsession, he was recollecting them. As he headed back toward the house, he noticed how the crust of snow glimmered with a scintillant reflected light. Against his will, his head came up. He looked into the deep and nearly cloudless sky. He said, "The moon." He knew then that he was a dead man. Laguna Beach, California. For Dominic Corvasis, Christmas was usually not much different from other days. He had no wife or children to make it special. Raised in foster homes, he had no relatives with whom he could share a turkey and mincemeat pie. A couple of friends, including Parker Fane, always invited him to join in their festivities, but he declined, for he knew he would feel like the proverbial fifth wheel. However, Christmas was not sad or lonely. He was never bored by his own company, and his home overflowed with good books that could fill the day with delight. But this Christmas, Dom could not concentrate to read, for he was preoccupied by the mysterious mail he had received the previous day, and by the need to resist the urge to pop a Valium. Though he had been afraid that he would dream and walk in his sleep, he had taken no Valium yesterday and no Dalmane last night. He was determined to avoid any further reliance on chemicals, though he continued to crave them. In fact, the craving became so bad that he emptied the pills into the toilet and flushed them away because he did not trust himself. As the day wore on, his anxiety rose to the level he'd experienced before he had begun drug therapy. At 7 o'clock Christmas night, Dom arrived at Parker's rambling hillside contemporary and accepted a glass of homemade eggnog with a cinnamon stick in it. The burly painter's beard, usually bushy and untamed, was neatly trimmed, and his mane of hair was newly cut and combed in honor of the holiday. Though he was more conservatively groomed and more subdued in dress than was his habit, he was every bit as ebullient as one expected him to be. What a Christmas! Peace and love reigned in this house today, I tell you. My cherished brother made only 40 or 50 nasty and envious remarks about my success, which is not half as many as he lets loose with on a less blessed occasion. My sainted half-sister Carla only once called her sister-in-law Doreen a bitch, and even that might be considered justified in light of the fact that Doreen started it by calling Carla a brainless new age crackpot full of psychobabble, quote-unquote. Truly a day of fellowship and caring. Not one punch thrown this year, if you can believe it. And Carla's husband, though he got plastered as usual, did not throw up or fall down a flight of stairs as in past years, though he did insist on doing his Bette Midler imitation at least a dozen times. As they moved toward a grouping of chairs by the window wall overlooking the sea, Dom said, I'm going on a trip, a long drive. I'll fly to Portland and rent a car up there. Then I'll retrace the journey I took the summer before last, from Portland down to Reno, across Nevada and half of Utah on Interstate 80, then to Mountain View. Dom sat down as he spoke, but Parker remained on his feet very still. The announcement pleasantly electrified him. What's happened? That's no vacation. That's not a route you'd take for pleasure. Are you sleepwalking again? Must be. And something's happened to convince you this is related to the changes you underwent that summer. I haven't begun sleepwalking again, but I'm sure I will. Probably tonight, because I've thrown the damn drugs away. They weren't curing me. I lied. I was getting hooked, Parker. I didn't care because it seemed that being hooked was better than enduring the things I did while sleepwalking. But now all that's changed because of these. He held up the 2 notes from his unknown correspondent. The problem's not just within me, not just psychological. There's something stranger at work here. He gave the first note to Parker. His fearful state of mind was betrayed by this sheet of paper, which shook in his hand. When the painter read it, he looked baffled. Dom said it came in the mail yesterday at the post office, no return address. There was another note delivered to the house. He explained about having typed the words, the moon, on his word processor hundreds of times in his sleep, and about waking from a dream with those same words on his lips, then passed the second note to Parker. But if I'm the first one you've told about this moon thing, how could anyone have known enough to send such a note? Whoever he is, Dom said he knows about my sleepwalking, maybe because I've gone to a doctor about it. You're saying you're being watched? Apparently to a degree, periodically monitored, if not constantly watched. But while the monitor knows about my sleepwalking, he probably doesn't know about my typing those words on the display writer, or that I woke up repeating them in the night. Not unless he was standing beside my bed, which he wasn't. However, he indisputably does know that I'll react to the moon, that those words will frighten me, so he must know what lies behind this whole crazy mess. At last, Parker sat down on the edge of a chair. Find him and you'll know what's going on. New York is a big place, Dom said. I have no starting point there, but when I got this first note, this business about the answer to my sleepwalking lying in the past, I realized you must be right about this personality crisis being tied to the previous one. The dramatic change I went through on the trip from Portland to Mountain View is somehow connected. If I make that trip again, stop at the same motels, eat in the same roadside restaurants, try to recreate it as exactly as I can, something might turn up, my memory might be jogged. But how could you have forgotten something so major? Maybe I didn't forget it. Maybe the memory was taken from me. Leaving that possibility for later exploration, Parker said, whoever the hell this guy is, what reasons would he have for sending these notes? I mean, you've imagined a situation where it's you against them, some unknown them, and so this guy is on their side, not yours. Maybe he doesn't agree with everything that's been done to me, whatever it is that I've forgotten was done to me. Done to you? What are we talking about here? Dom nervously turned his glass of eggnog around and around in his hands. I don't know. But this correspondent, he obviously wants me to know my problem's not psychological. There's something more behind it. I think maybe he wants to help me find the truth. So why doesn't he just call you up and tell you the truth? The only thing I can figure is that he doesn't dare risk telling me. He must be part of some conspiracy, God knows what, but part of some group that doesn't want the truth to come out. If he approaches me directly, the others will know and he'll be in deep shit. As if it helped him think, Parker ran one hand through his hair several times, mussing it badly. You make this sound like some all-knowing secret society is on your ass, like the Illuminati Society, Rosicrucians, CIA, and the Fraternal Order of Masons all rolled into one. You actually think you've been brainwashed, if you want to call it that. Whatever traumatic episode I've forgotten, I didn't forget it without assistance. Whatever I saw or experienced was apparently so shocking, so traumatic that it's still festering in my subconscious, trying to reach me through sleepwalking and through the messages I leave on the display writer. It was so damn big that even brainwashing hasn't been able to wipe it out. So big that one of the conspirators is risking his own neck to send me hints. After reading them one more time, Parker returned the 2 notes to Dom, tugged down his own eggnog. Shit. I think you've got to be right, which upsets me. I don't want to believe it. Sounds too much as if you've let your novelistic imagination run wild, as if you're trying out the plot of a new book on me. Something a bit more colorful than you should write. But crazy as the whole thing sounds, I can't think of any other answer. Dom realized he was squeezing the eggnog glass so tightly that he was in danger of shattering it. He put it on a small table and blotted his hands on his slacks. Me neither. There's nothing else that explains both the crazy damn sleepwalking and my personality change between Portland and Mountain View and those 2 notes. His face lined with worry, Parker said, What could it have been, Dom? What did you stumble into when you were out there on the road? I don't have the foggiest. Have you considered that it might be something so bad, so damn dangerous, that you'd be better off not knowing? Dom nodded. But if I don't learn the truth, I won't be able to stop the sleepwalking for good. In my sleep, I'm running from the memory of whatever happened to me out there on the road the summer before last. And to stop running, I've got to find out what it was, face up to it. Because if I don't stop the sleepwalking, it'll eventually drive me mad. That might sound a bit melodramatic too, but it's true. If I don't learn the truth, then the thing I fear in my dreams is going to start haunting the waking hours as well. And I'm not going to have a moment's peace waking or sleeping. And eventually the only solution will be to put a gun in my mouth and pull the trigger. Jesus. I mean it. I know you do. God help you, my friend. I know you do. Reno, Nevada. A cloud saved Zeb Lomack had drifted across the moon before the grip of the lunar obsession had completely reclaimed him. With the Imperial lantern lantern briefly dimmed, Zebediah abruptly became aware that he was standing coatless in the freezing December night, gaping up at the sky, mesmerized by moonbeams. If the cloud had not broken the trance, he might have stood there until the object of his grim fascination had descended past the horizon. Then, having sunk back into his lunacy, he might have returned to one of the rooms papered with the ancient god face that the Greeks called Cynthia, that the Romans called Diana, there to lie in a stupor until days hence he had starved to death. Reprieved, he let out a wretched cry and ran to the house. He slipped and fell in the snow, fell again on the porch steps, but immediately scrambled up, desperately seeking the safety of the indoors, where the face of the moon could not work its charms on him. But of course there was no safety inside either. Though he closed his eyes and began at once to tear blindly at the moon pictures, ripping them from the kitchen walls and casting them on the garbage-covered floor, he began to succumb to his obsession yet again. Eyes tightly shut, he could not see the cratered images, but he could feel them. He could feel the pale light of 100 moons upon his face, and he could feel the roundness of the moons in his hands as he tore them off the wall, which was crazy, because they were only pictures that could not produce light or warmth, and could not convey by touch the roundness of the lunar globe. Yet he nevertheless felt those things strongly. He opened his eyes and was instantly captured by the familiar celestial body. Just like my dad, asylum-bound. Like a distant crackle of lightning, that thought flickered through Zeb Lomac's rapidly dimming mind. It jolted him and allowed him to recover just long enough to turn away from the living room door and fling himself toward the kitchen table where the loaded shotgun waited. Chicago, Illinois. Father Stefan Wykazik, descendant of strong-willed Poles, rescuer of troubled priests, was not accustomed to failure, and he did not handle it well. "But after everything I've told you, how can you still not believe?" he demanded. Brendan Cronin said, "Father Stefan, I'm sorry, but I simply don't feel any stronger about the existence of God than I did yesterday." They were in a bedroom on the second floor of Brendan's parents' ginger snap brick house in the Irish neighborhood called Bridgeport, where the young priest was spending the holiday according to Father Wykazik's orders, issued yesterday after the uptown shootout. Brendan, dressed in gray slacks and a white shirt, was sitting on the edge of a double bed that was covered by a worn yellow Chanel spread. Stefan, choosing to feel needled by his curate's stubbornness, moved constantly around the room, from dresser to highboy to window to bed to dresser again, as if trying to avoid the prickling pain of his failure. "Tonight," Father Wykazik said, "I met an atheist who was half converted by Tok's incredible recovery, but you're unimpressed." "I'm happy for Dr. Soniford," Brendan said mildly, "but his renewed belief doesn't rekindle my own." The curate's refusal to be properly impressed by recent miraculous events was not the only thing that irritated Father Wykazik. The young priest's specific demeanor was also bothersome. If he could not find the will to believe in God again, then it seemed he should at least be disheartened and downcast by his continued lack of faith. Instead, Brendan appeared untroubled by his miserable spiritual condition, which was quite different from his attitude when Father Wykazik had seen him last. He had changed dramatically. For reasons that were not at all clear, a great peace seemed to have settled over Brendan. Still determinedly pressing his argument, Stefan said, "It was you, Brendan, who cured Emmy Halborg and healed Winton Toke. It was you, through the power of those stigmata on your hands, stigmata that God visited upon you as a sign." Brendan looked at his palms, now unmarked. "I believe somehow I did heal Emmy and Winton, but it wasn't God acting through me." "Who else but God could have granted you such curing power?" "I don't know," Brendan said. "Wish I did, but it wasn't God. I felt no divine presence, Father." "Good grief, how much more strongly do you expect him to make his presence felt? Do you expect him to thump you on the head with his great staff of justice, tip his diadem to you, and introduce himself? You've got to meet him halfway, Brendan." The curate smiled and shrugged. "Father, I know these amazing events seem to have no explanation other than a religious one, but I feel very strongly that something other than God lies behind it." "Like what?" Stefan challenged. "I don't know. Something tremendously important, something really wonderful and magnificent, but not God. Look, what you've said, that the rings Look, you've said that the rings were stigmata, but if that's what they were, why wouldn't they have been in a form that had some Christian significance? Why rings, which seem to have no relation to the message of Christ? When Brendan began Stefan's unconventional course of psychological therapy at St. Joseph's Hospital for Children 3 weeks ago, the young priest had been so troubled by his loss of faith that he'd been growing rapidly thinner. Now he had stopped losing weight. He was still 30 pounds lighter than usual, but he was no longer as wan and haggard as he had been following his shocking outburst during Mass on the 1st of December. In spite of his spiritual fall, there was a glow to his skin and a light in his eyes that was almost beatific. "You feel splendid, don't you?" Stefan asked. "Yes, though I'm not sure why." "Your soul's no longer troubled?" "No." "Even though you've still not found your way back to God?" "Even though," Brendan agreed. "Maybe it has something to do with the dream I had last night." "The black gloves again?" "No, haven't had that one in a while," Brendan said. "Last night I dreamed that I was walking in a place of pure golden light, beautiful light, so bright I could see nothing around me, and yet it didn't hurt my eyes." A peculiar note, perhaps of reverence, entered the curate's voice. "In the dream I keep walking and walking, not knowing where I am or where I'm going, but with the sense that I'm approaching a thing or a place of monumental importance and unbearable beauty. Not just approaching, but being called to it. Not an audible call, but a summons that just reverberates in me. My heart is pounding and I'm a little afraid, but it isn't a bad fear, Father. What I feel in that bright place, not bad at all. So I just keep walking through the light, towards something magnificent that I can't see, but that I know is there." Drawn by Brendan's hushed voice as if by a magnet, Father Wygazik moved to the bed and sat upon the corner of it. "But surely this is a spiritual dream, the call of God coming to you in sleep. He's calling you back to your faith, back to your duties of your office. Back to the duties of your office." Brendan shook his head. "No, there was no religious quality to the dream, no sense of a divine presence. It was a different kind of awe that filled me, a joy unlike the joy I knew in Christ. I woke up 4 times during the night, and each time I woke, the rings were on my hands. And each time that I fell back to sleep, I dropped into the same dream again. Something very strange and important is happening, Father, and I'm part of it. But whatever it is, it's not anything that my education, experiences, or previous beliefs have prepared me for." Father Wygazik wondered if the call that had come to Brendan in the dream had been from Satan instead of God. Perhaps the devil, aware that a priest's soul was in jeopardy, had dressed his hateful form in this deceptively attractive golden light, the better to lead the curate from the righteous path. Still firmly determined to bring his curate back into the fold, but temporarily out of winning strategies, Stefan Wygazik decided to call a truce. He said, "So, what now? You aren't ready to put on your Roman collar and resume your duties, as I thought you'd be by now. Do you want me to contact Lee Kellogg, the Illinois provincial, and ask him to authorize psychiatric counseling?" Psychiatric counseling? Brendan smiled. "No, that doesn't appeal to me anymore. I don't believe it'd do any good. What I'd like to do, if it's all right with you, Father, is move back into my room in the rectory and wait this out, see what happens. Of course, as I remain a fallen away priest, I can't hear confessions or say Mass. But while I'm waiting to see what happens, I could do some cooking, help you catch up on the filing." Father Wygazik was relieved. He had expected Brendan to express the intention of returning to a secular life. You're welcome, of course. There's much you can do. I'll keep you busy. No need to worry about that. But tell me, Brendan, you do think there's a possibility that you'll find your way back? The curate nodded. I don't feel alienated from God anymore, just empty of Him. As the situation develops, perhaps it'll lead me back to the church as you're convinced it will. I just don't know. Still frustrated and disappointed by Brendan's refusal to see the miraculous presence of God in the healing of Emmy and Winton, Father Wyckowick was nonetheless glad that he would have the curate close and be provided the opportunity to continue guiding him back to salvation. Brendan went downstairs with Father Wyckowick, and at the front door, the two men embraced in such a way that a stranger, without any knowledge of their occupation, would have thought them father and son. Accompanying Father Wyckowick as far as the front stoop, where a blustery wind gave a howl more suited to Halloween than to Christmas, Brendan said, I don't know why or how, Father Stefan, but I feel we're about to embark upon an amazing adventure. The discovery or rediscovery of faith is always an amazing adventure, Brendan, Father Wyckowick said. Then, having gotten in the last clean jab, as a good fighter for souls should always do, he left. Reno, Nevada. Whimpering, gasping for breath, struggling valiantly against the narcotizing effect of his lunar obsession, Zeb Lomack clambered through the garbage and squirming roaches that carpeted the kitchen, grabbed the shotgun that lay upon the table, jammed the barrel between his teeth, and suddenly realized that his arms were not long enough to reach the trigger. The urge to look up at the bewitching moons on the walls was so overpowering that he felt as if someone had hold of him by the hair and was pulling his head back to force his gaze up from the floor. And when he closed his eyes defensively, it seemed as if some invisible adversary began to pry insistently at his eyelids. In his horror of being committed to a madhouse like his father, he found the strength to resist the mesmeric moon call. Eyes still closed, he collapsed into a chair, kicked off one shoe, stripped away the sock, braced the shotgun with both hands, put the barrel in his mouth, raised his unshod foot, and touched one bare toe to the cold trigger. Imagined moonlight on his skin and imagined lunar tides in his blood, parentheses no less forceful for being imaginary, close parentheses, demanded his attention with such sudden power that he opened his eyes, saw the many moons on the walls, and cried, "No!" into the barrel of the gun. Even as the spellbinding moon call pulled him back toward a trance, even as he pressed his foot down upon the trigger, the swelling memory balloon at last burst in his mind, and he remembered everything that had been taken away from him. The summer before last, Dominic, Ginger, Faye, Ernie, the young priest, the others, Interstate 80, the Tranquility Motel, oh God, the motel, and oh God, the moon. Perhaps Zebediah Lomack was unable to check the downward motion of his bare foot, or perhaps instead the suddenly revealed memory was so terrible that it encouraged suicide. Whichever the case, the 12-gauge went off with a roar, and the back of his head blew out, and for him, though for no one else, the terror ended. Boston, Massachusetts. All Christmas afternoon, Ginger Weiss read Twilight in Babylon, and at 7 o'clock that evening, when it was time to go downstairs for drinks and dinner with the Hannaby family, she resented the interruption and did not want to put the book aside. She was a willing captive of the engrossing story, but she was more captivated by the photo of the author, Dominic Corvace's commanding eyes and dark good looks continued to arouse in her an uneasiness bordering on fear, and she could not overcome the peculiar feeling that she knew him. Dinner with her hosts, their children and grandchildren, might have been pleasurable if Dominic Corvasis had not exerted a mysteriously powerful claim on her attention. At 10 o'clock, when she could at last gracefully withdraw without offending anyone, she cast out and gathered in a final series of Christmas wishes for happiness and health, then returned to her room. She began reading where she had left off, and with a minimum of interruption to scrutinize the author's photograph again, she finished the book at 3:45 a.m. In the deep post-midnight silence that had settled over Baywatch, Ginger sat with the book in her lap, jacket photo turned up, her eyes fixed on Dominic Corvasis' hauntingly familiar face. Minute by minute, as she sat in her strange, silent, one-sided communion with the writer's image, Ginger became increasingly convinced that she had met the man somewhere, and that he was, in some unimaginable fashion, part of her recent troubles. Although her steadily growing conviction was tempered by the realization that this intuition might be part of the same mental disturbance that generated her fugues, and might therefore be unreliable, her agitation and excitement increased until, shaky and distraught, she was finally driven to action. Leaving her room with exaggerated stealth, she went downstairs through the dark and untenanted rooms of the great slumbering house into the kitchen. She switched on the light and used the wall phone to call information in Laguna Beach. It was 1 o'clock in the morning in California, too rude an hour to wake Corvasis. But if she could get a number for him, she would sleep better, knowing that she could get in touch with him in the morning. To her dismay, though not to her surprise, his number was unlisted. Switching off the kitchen light and creeping quietly back to her room, Ginger made up her mind to write Corvasis in the morning, care of his publisher. She would dispatch the message by express mail with an urgent plea to the publisher to forward the letter immediately. Perhaps attempting to contact him was precipitate and irrational. Perhaps she had never met him, and perhaps he had nothing to do with her bizarre affliction. Perhaps he'd think she was a crackpot. But if this 1,000,000-to-1 shot proved a good bet, the payoff might be her very salvation, which was sufficient reward to risk making a fool of herself. Laguna Beach, California. As yet unaware that an advance review copy of his book had made a vital link between himself and a deeply troubled woman in Boston, Don remained at Parker Fane's house until midnight, discussing the possible nature of the conspiracy that he had theorized. Neither he nor Parker had enough information to put together a detailed or even slightly useful picture of the conspirators, but the very process of sharing and exploring the mystery with their friend made it less frightening. They agreed that Dom should not fly to Portland and begin his odyssey until he saw how bad his sleepwalking became now that he had thrown away the Valium and Dalmane. Maybe somnambulism would not recur, as he expected it would, in which case he could travel without fear of losing control of himself in a distant place. But if he resumed his night rambling, he would need a couple of weeks to decide on the best way of restraining himself during sleep before heading to Portland. Besides, by waiting a while, he might receive additional letters from his unknown correspondent. Those clues might make the trek from Portland to Mountain View unnecessary, or might target a specific area along that route as the place where Dom would encounter some sight or experience that would free his imprisoned memories. By midnight, when Dom rose to leave Parker's hillside house, the artist had become so intrigued by the situation that he looked as if he would be up for hours yet, his mind spinning. "You're sure it's wise to be alone tonight?" he asked at the front door. Dom stepped outside onto a walkway patterned with spiky geometric forms of darkness and wedge-shaped slices of yellow light, which were formed by the beams of a decorative iron lantern, half obscured by shadow-casting palm fronds. Looking back at his friend, he said, "We've been through this before. It might not be wise, but it's the only way." "You'll call if you need help?" "I'll call," Dom said. "And take those precautions we talked about." Dom attended to those precautions a short while later at home. He removed the pistol from his nightstand, locked it in a drawer of his office desk, and buried the desk key under a package of ice cream in the freezer. Better to be unprepared for a burglar than to risk firing the gun while sound asleep. Next, from a coil of rope in the garage, he cut a 10-foot length. After brushing his teeth and undressing, he knotted one end of the line securely around his right wrist in such a way that he could escape only by untying 4 difficult knots. He secured the other end of the rope to one post of the headboard, taking care to fasten it tightly. With 1 foot of the line's length used for the knots, he was left with 9 feet of play, enough to assure his comfort while keeping him tethered within a safe distance of the bed. In previous somnambulistic episodes, he had performed complex tasks that had required some concentration, though nothing quite so tedious as the unraveling of well-made knots, which were often a challenge to him when he was awake. In his sleep, he would surely lack the coordination and mental focus to free himself, and the effort to do so would be frustrating enough to wake him. Being thus hampered involved some danger. If a fire broke out in the night, or if the house were damaged in an earthquake, he might be so delayed by the need to untie himself that he would perish in the smoke or beneath a collapsing wall. He had to risk it. When he turned out the bedside light and slipped under the blanket, drawing the rope from one arm, the glowing red numerals of the digital clock read 12:58. Staring at the dark ceiling, wondering what in the name of God he had become involved in out there on the road the summer before last, he waited for sleep to creep upon him. On the nightstand, the telephone was silent. If his number had not been unlisted, he might have received at that moment a long-distance call from a lonely and frightened young woman in Boston, a call that would have radically changed the course of the next few weeks and might have saved lives. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In the guest room of her only daughter's house, where a nightlight burned in consideration of Ernie's phobia, Faye Black listened to her husband as, asleep and dreaming, he mumbled into his pillow. A few minutes ago, she had been awakened when he had let out a soft cry and had thrashed for a moment in the sheets. Now she raised herself on one elbow, cocked her head, and listened intently, trying to decipher his muffled speech. He was saying the same thing again and again into the pillow. The almost panicky urgency in his voice made Faye nervous. She leaned closer to him, straining to understand. Suddenly he shifted his head just enough to turn his mouth from the pillow, and his words became clear, though no less mysterious than when they had been muffled. The moon, the moon, the moon, the moon. Las Vegas, Nevada. Georgia took Marcy into her own bed that night because it did not seem like a good idea to leave the girl alone after the disturbing events of the day. She did not get much rest because all night Marcy seemed to phase in and out of nightmares, frequently kicking at the sheets, squirming vigorously as if to free herself from restraining hands, and talking in her sleep about doctors and needles. Georgia wondered how long this had been going on. Their bedrooms were separated by back-to-back closets, insulated by hanging clothes, and the child's sleep talk was very soft, so it was possible that she had passed a lot of nights in unconscious terror without Georgia being aware of it. Her voice raised gooseflesh in Georgia's arms. In the morning, she would take Marcy to the doctor. Given her unexplained dread of all physicians, the girl might cause a hell of a scene. But as much as Marcy feared going to a doctor, Georgia feared not going. If it had not been so hard to locate the right physician on Christmas Day, Georgia would have gone for help already. She was scared. Following Marcy's outburst when her grandfather's teasing about taking her to a hospital had driven her away from the table in a mad panic, the day had gone downhill. The girl was so overcome by fear that she peed her pants, and for 10 or 15 hideously embarrassing and terrifying minutes, she resisted all George's efforts to get her cleaned up. She screamed, scratched, and kicked. The tantrum passed at last, and she submitted to a bath, but she was like a little zombie, slack-faced and empty-eyed, as if the terror in passing out of her had taken with it all her strength and her mind as well. That quasi-catatonic state lasted almost an hour, while Georgia made a dozen telephone calls in an attempt to track down Dr. Besancourt, the pediatrician who treated Marcy on those rare occasions when she was sick. As Mary and Pete tried unsuccessfully to get a smile, or at least a word of response from the stricken girl, and as Marcy continued to act as if she were deaf and mute, George's mind was increasingly filled with half-remembered magazine articles about autistic children. She couldn't recall whether autism was a condition that began in infancy, or whether it was possible for a perfectly normal little girl of 7 to suddenly withdraw into a private place and close out the rest of the world forever. Not being able to remember made her a little crazy. Gradually, however, Marcy came out of her daze. She began to answer Mary and Pete, though in one-word replies, delivered in a flat, emotionless voice, nearly as unsettling as her screams had been earlier. Sucking on her thumb as she had not done in at least 2 years, she went into the living room to play with her new toys. Most of the afternoon she played without any visible pleasure, a faint scowl having taken unchallenged possession of her small face. Georgia was no less worried because of this change, but she was relieved to see that Marcy showed no further interest in the little Miss Doctor kit. By 4:30, the girl's scowl had faded, and she had become sociable once more. In a good mood again, she was such a natural charmer that she almost made it seem as if her outburst at the table had been no worse than any child's temper tantrum. In fact, on the outside stairs of the apartment complex, beyond Marcy's hearing, George's mother paused on the way down to the car and said, "She's just trying to let us know that she's hurt and confused. She doesn't understand why her father left. And right now she needs a lot of special attention, Georgia. A lot of love, that's all." Georgia knew the problem was worse than that. She had no doubt that Marcy was still disturbed by her father's behavior, deeply hurt by his abandonment, and full of unresolved conflicts. But something else was eating the girl, something that seemed disturbingly irrational, and Georgia was scared of it. Not long after Pete and Mary left, the girl began playing Little Miss Doctor with the same unnerving intensity she had exhibited earlier, and when bedtime came, she wanted to take the kit with her. Now, some of the Little Miss Doctor things lay on the floor at Marcy's side of the bed, some on the nightstand, and in the dark bedroom, the child dreamed and whimpered about doctors, nurses, needles. Georgia would have been unable to sleep even if Marcy had been perfectly still and quiet. Worry induced insomnia even more effectively than a dozen cups of coffee. Since she was awake anyway, she listened attentively to her daughter's every dreamy utterance, hoping that she would hear something that would help her understand, or that would assist the doctor in arriving at his diagnosis. It was after 2 o'clock in the morning when Marcy mumbled something different from what she had mumbled before, something that had nothing to do with doctors and nurses and big sharp needles. With a flurry of violent kicks, the girl flopped from her stomach onto her back, gasped, and went rigid, perfectly still. "The moon, the moon," she said, in a voice that was filled with both amazement and fear. "The moon." A voice of such chilling, whispery urgency that Georgia knew it was not just meaningless sleep talk. The moon, moon, moon. Chicago, Illinois. Brendan Cronin, priest on probation, slept warmly under a blanket and patchwork quilt, smiling at something in a dream. The winter wind sighed through the giant pine tree outside, fluted and soft in the eaves, and moaned at his window, exerting itself in evenly spaced gusts, as if nature were ventilating the night with the huge mechanical bellows that faithfully produced 8 exhalations to the minute. Even lost in his dream, Brendan must have been aware of the wind's slow pulse, for when he began to talk in his sleep, the words issued from him in a sympathetic rhythm. The moon, the moon, the moon, the moon. Laguna Beach, California. The moon, the moon. Dominic Corvasis was awakened by his own fearful shouting and by a burning pain in his right wrist. He was on his hands and knees in the darkness beside his bed, wrenching frantically at something that had a grip on his arm. He continued to struggle for a few seconds until the mists of sleep cleared, whereupon he realized that he was being held by nothing more sinister than the rope with which he had tethered himself. Breathing raggedly, heart pounding, he fumbled for the lamp switch and winced as the sudden light stung his eyes. A quick look at the restraining rope showed that, in his sleep and in the dark, he had completely untied one of the 4 tightly drawn knots, and partially unraveled a second before losing patience for the task. Then, in the panic that always accompanied his sleepwalking, he evidently had begun to pull and tug and twist against the belaying line, as if he were a dumb animal protesting a leash, painfully abrading his right wrist. Dom got off the floor and, pushing aside the tangled blanket, sat on the edge of the bed. He knew he had been dreaming, though he could not recall anything about the dream. However, he was pretty sure that it was not the nightmare he had endured on other occasions during the past month, for that one had nothing to do with the moon. This was another dream, equally terrifying, but in a different way. His shouts, which had been partly responsible for waking him, had been so importunate, so haunted, so fright-filled, that he could even now summon them in memory as clearly as he had first heard them. The moon! The moon! He shuddered and raised his hands to his throbbing head. The moon. What did it mean? Boston, Massachusetts. Ginger sat straight up in bed with a shrill cry. Lavinia, the Hannaby's housekeeper, said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Weiss. Didn't mean to scare you. You were having a nightmare." Nightmare? Ginger had no recollection of a dream. "Oh, yes," Lavinia said, "and a really bad one from the sound of it. I was passing the hall when I heard you crying out. I almost came in right away until I realized you must be dreaming. I hesitated then, but you went on, shouting it over and over again until I thought I'd better wake you." Blinking, Ginger said, "Shouting? What was I shouting?" Over and over again, the housekeeper said, "The moon, the moon, the moon." You sounded so frightened. "I don't remember." "The moon," Lavinia assured her, "the moon," over and over again, in such a voice that I half thought someone was killing you.